Robb Stark stood in the crypts beneath Winterfell, listening to the hush of his own breath in the darkness. The stone likenesses of his ancestors watched him with cool, silent eyes, and he could almost hear the memory of their voices carried by the subterranean winds that snaked through the tunnels. There, amid the carved effigies of once great men and women, the king in the north felt more vulnerable than he ever had on the battlefield. He had come seeking wisdom, though not in the customary way. This time, he was no longer that straightforward boy who had marched off to war in the wake of his father's death, determined only to defend his family's honor and prove himself a man. Now, he stood at the crossroads of paths seldom traveled by lords of Westeros, paths of half-forgotten knowledge that promised new ways to protect the north. The crypts below Winterfell were the old bones of his house, the deep bedrock upon which everything he believed in rested. If he was to dare the shadows of old magic, this was the place to start. It was said that the Starks had secrets older than any living memory, older even than the Undul invasions or the First Men's Wars. It was also said that the blood of the North itself hummed with ancient powers. Robb had never thought that rumor anything more than a fireside tale. Until recently, Winterfell's librarians had chanced upon several fragments of parchment describing old Valyrian incantations, hidden in the castle's least explored nooks. The parchments had traveled a long, circuitous route, from across the narrow sea, apparently, then into the hands of some long-forgotten maester who had once served the Starks before the conquest. Whoever that maester was, he had recorded pieces of ritual and verse in a meticulous, cramped script. The pages lay neglected for centuries, half-decayed and worm-eaten. But in them, Robb saw an opportunity that might level the playing field against enemies who seemed too numerous, too cunning, that might save the North from the doom bearing down on it. He remembered the hour the ragged maester, old Darren, who had dug through the corners of the library, came to him. The old man's eyes had glinted with worry and a flicker of excitement. "My lord," Maester Darren had said, voice trembling, "what I found is, well, it could change everything if only you can interpret it." Robb had taken the parchments from Darren's shaking hands, scanning lines of jagged old Valyrian script. He understood so little of it at first, but a piece of him felt called by those words, as if they were vibrating in his blood. He was not a maester, certainly not schooled in Valyrian the way some Targaryens were. Still, something deep inside him lit up at those words. He kept reading night after night, his heart pounding in his chest at the possibility. He recalled an evening near the hearth in Winterfell's great hall. The pages spread before him as the voices of advisors and lords fell into background chatter. Lines of Valyrian script, spidery across the parchment, whispered a promise of power, a power that might rival the cunning of House Lannister or any other house that threatened his people. He spent hours locked away in the library. He pored over what meager resources existed on old Valyria, and in those lonely nights, with only the pale flame of a single candle, he labored to piece together words that had not been spoken in Westeros for centuries. He all but haunted the old corners of Winterfell in search of clues. Sometimes Grey Wind, his dire wolf, would slink beside him, strangely silent, as if the beast could sense the shift in the air. Now, in the bowels of his home, the crypt air chilled him more than the wind above. "Let me feel your strength," Robb murmured as he set his hand on the cold stone of his father's resting place. He had never felt so alone in his decisions, not even when he had first been declared king in the north. Yet, thinking of his father, of how Ned Stark had never flinched from a duty, no matter how grim, he found a spark of courage. He knelt in front of the statue of Lord Eddard Stark. Although his father had not been buried here in the usual manner, the statue had been erected to join the line of Stark lords. The idea of harnessing magic might have angered or frightened the man who raised him, but Ned Stark had taught Robb to do whatever it took to safeguard the people entrusted to him. To be honorable but not foolish. If the times demanded extraordinary measures, might Ned have done the same? Robb's gut twisted with uncertainty. Perhaps, perhaps not. But the boy had died the day he heard of his father's execution. The man he had become needed weapons mightier than swords. He rose with the swirl of dust motes dancing in the torchlight and made his way deeper into the crypt. It felt as if the darkness itself whispered in old Valyrian. Through the gloom, he could smell centuries of still air, the faint musk of stone and earth. He tried to calm his breath. He needed the power of these oldest places if he hoped to bend old Valyrian magic to his will. That was how it was written in the parchments. Magic was not learned from a neat lesson or a polite demonstration in a glass-towered library. It was awakened, coaxed, and tested in realms of silence and bones. He paused when he reached the hidden nook beyond the tombs of the ancient kings of winter. It was here he had prepared a small altar of sorts. Simple, just a large flat rock and a circlet of smaller stones, with runes carved upon them to mirror what the parchment indicated. A single candle flickered on that makeshift altar, its small flame defiant against the boundless dark. Robb set a hand to Grey Wind's flank to steady himself. The direwolf's hackles were raised. Softly, Robb began chanting the old Valyrian words he had practiced, tripping on some syllables, correcting them under his breath. The invocation was said to call upon the elemental forces that once shaped the freehold. Fire, blood, shadow, and scale. Over and over, he recited the phrases. He closed his eyes, letting the words flow out of him, trying to let that ancient music carry him the way the parchment said it must. He was the conduit. He was the bridge. At first, he felt nothing except the slow growth of weariness. His mind wandered to the battles he'd fought, to the men who had bled for him, to the rumors that Tywin Lannister was massing new armies. He recalled the Freys and their endless demands, the persistent sense that the North might soon stand alone, and the question if his own cause had begun to falter. Then, as he drifted into that swirl of anxious thoughts, he felt a tug deep in his belly. The very air around him seemed to grow heavier. He inhaled sharply. His skin prickled. Inside his mind, an image flickered, great, scaled beasts soaring over a burning city, fire raining from their jaws. Visions of Valyria at its height, forging steel with sorcery, speaking words of power that shaped the fate of continents. He saw men and women in robes chanting. He saw them raise their hands toward the sky, commanding the elements themselves. And then, with a flash, he saw terror, a great doom swallowing that mighty civilization. Flames, smoke, molten rock, and screams of agony. Robb staggered, would have fallen if not for Grey Wind's solid presence. The direwolf whined, shifting uncertainly. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to continue chanting, voice shaking. Another wave of awareness coursed through him, more potent. It felt as if every hair on his body rose at once. The air around him began to stir, even in that enclosed crypt. Flickers of light appeared at the edges of his vision, a swirl of intangible shapes, dancing in the gloom. His breath caught in his throat as he felt something respond, some primal force that recognized his words, recognized his intention. The flickering candle flared bright for an instant, and he felt his body tighten. It was happening. Then, with an abrupt snap, all the swirling shapes vanished. Robb gasped, stumbling against the makeshift altar, panting as if he'd run a league. Silence rushed in. The candle guttered once more, returning to its dim flame. Had he failed? Had the crypt's stillness reasserted its dominion? He listened. The soft drip of water somewhere behind the walls was the only sound. And yet, there was a pulse within him, faint but new, a coiling in his core that felt both foreign and familiar. He swallowed hard, bracing his hands on the altar. He knew in that moment that a seed had been planted. The magic was not his to control, not yet, but it had recognized him. It recognized his blood and the fervor in his heart, just as he recognized it. If he nurtured that spark, if he kept chanting and learning, perhaps it could be coaxed into something. He did not fool himself into thinking it would be easy. Power never came without cost, as his father had once told him. Yet it was a path he had chosen. For the sake of the North, for the sake of all who looked to him for protection, he would see it through. In the coming days, Robb carried on his kingly duties, giving orders to his generals, sending ravens, holding court with his bannermen. But whenever he had a spare moment in the hush of night, he returned to that hidden place to recite more incantations. He practiced forging the link between himself and that strange old Valyrian current. More than once, the crypt echoed with his voice, trembling with resonances he could not fully contain. At times he felt heat rise in his blood as if it might sear him from the inside out. At other times he tasted cold metal on his tongue, and the lines between life and death became thin. Dreams haunted him. In them, he wandered the halls of a blackened fortress under a sky full of dragons, or glimpsed shadows that whispered in a language he almost understood. Throughout it all, Grey Wind stayed close, never leaving his side, not even when the direwolf's hackles rose involuntarily. That silent support comforted Robb when fear threatened to break him. If old lore told him anything, it was that all magic demanded a price. He was determined that if he must pay it, he would do so for his people, for House Stark. As the moon waned, a chill in the air told him winter was creeping closer. The harvests were underway in the north, the small folk anxious to gather what they could. War had left scars across the countryside. Burned farms, missing sons, empty storehouses. The people looked to their king in the north to hold back the storms of enemies. The Lannisters still had King's Landing, and whispers of new alliances danced in the wind. More alarmingly, there were rumors from the distant edges beyond the wall. Rumors that the Night's Watch had encountered forces so old they scarcely seemed real. Robb had little time to weigh all these dangers, yet weigh them he must. And now, another weight pressed upon him. The blossoming presence of old Valyrian magic in his veins. He noticed subtle changes in himself. Sometimes in the courtyard at dawn, as he drilled with his sword, a flare of power would pulse through him, making him strike with a sudden, preternatural strength. He tried to conceal it from those around him. He did not want to be known as a sorcerer or, gods forbid, some dark practitioner that might sow panic among his own men or brand him a heretic in the eyes of the faith of the Seven. Even the lords of the north, who had their own traditions, might look on such power with suspicion. Yet the changes were undeniable. Sometimes in the Godswood, as he knelt by the heart tree, he felt flickers of temperature shift in the air around him, as if the leaves themselves were breathing with him. He sensed, in fleeting moments, what felt like the heartbeat of the land. Though he was no green seer, Bran was the one who had seemed touched by warging and visions. He wondered if these forms of magic were connected. The direwolves had come to them as if guided by fate, after all. And some said the old gods were not silent watchers but living watchers, watching through the hearts of weirwoods. Was there a link between the old gods of the north and the old Valyrian incantations? If so, it was something the histories did not describe well. Despite his caution, a few of his closest companions noticed changes. One morning, as Robb stood in the training yard with the Great John and other bannermen, the Great John asked, "Your Grace, is something ailing you? You look, I can't say, different." Robb forced a tight-lipped smile and brushed it off as lack of sleep. "War weighs heavily on me, Great John. The nightmares don't cease." He gave no further explanation, and the Great John, being ever loyal, did not pry. Still, Robb could feel those sharp eyes studying him. His mother, Lady Catelyn, was more insistent. "You hardly rest," she chided him one day in the solar. "You're up before the sun and go to bed well after it sets. You're pushing yourself too hard. Robb, you must not wear yourself to a blade's edge." He took her hand. "I am all right, Mother. These are dangerous times. I do only what I must." He saw in her eyes the fear and the heartbreak of having lost a husband, and the fear of losing her eldest son too. He pressed her hand more gently and gave her the best reassurance he could. "I promise, Mother, I will endure." She nodded, although the lines in her face did not ease. That night, in the crypt once more, he tried a different incantation described by the parchments, one that called for a small personal sacrifice to deepen the bond. His heart pounded as he pricked his thumb with a thin blade. A bead of blood welled up on his skin, dark and glistening. He held his hand over the runes carved in the altar's stone, reciting words that made his tongue tingle and lips burn. The drop of blood fell. A faint glow shimmered across the markings, and Robb swore he felt the presence behind that magic pressing closer, like a beast coming to sniff at his door. He pressed his bleeding thumb to one of the carved runes, chanting. Heat climbed up his arm, flaring in his chest. Then the glow dimmed. Robb breathed heavily, sweat sheening his brow, uncertain what precisely he had done or awakened. The parchments spoke of forging a deeper resonance with the spells, but they were incomplete. The notes scrawled in the margins had warned, "Blood is key, but blood is also a chain. If you bleed, you bind yourself, for good or ill." Over the next days, the weather turned bitter more quickly than usual. Gales hammered Winterfell's walls at night. Robb, caught between the demands of war councils, supply management, and ravens delivering grim tidings from the Riverlands, found himself wading through an overwhelming mixture of stress and a new, urgent sense that something was calling him from beyond the mortal realm. More than once, he had to close his eyes in the midst of a meeting, pressing his temples to clear a sudden wave of dizziness. When he opened them again, he sometimes caught glimpses of flames dancing in the corners of the room, only to vanish when he looked directly at them. Yet for all these disturbances, he was also discovering subtle abilities. One evening, as he struggled to read a blotched old text by candlelight, he found the Valyrian words shifting into clarity. It was as though his mind itself rearranged the script into comprehensible shapes. He closed the text, heart pounding, wondering how the knowledge had come to him. He could sometimes sense the moods of those around him, as if their emotions brushed against him like breezes. This budding empathy, while faint, gave him insight into his lord's hearts during councils. He swiftly noted who harbored fear, who was resolute, and whose loyalty might be fraying under the prolonged war. He used that awareness to guide his decisions, forging alliances with a deftness that seemed to impress even Catelyn. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly after one such council. Robb only nodded. If she suspected something deeper behind his growing acumen, she did not voice it. Finally, word came that Tywin Lannister was marching northward with an army to punish the North for their defiance. Scouts reported that Tywin had somehow supplemented his ranks with a large contingent from the Reach, likely renegade lords allied with the Lannisters through fear or gold. Pressure mounted on Robb to ride south and meet them before they reached Moat Cailin, that ancient choke point that was the gateway to the north. Yet the memory of the disastrous negotiations with Walder Frey still weighed upon him. The crossing at the Twins had cost him men and alliances. Now the Freys seemed more distant than ever. Roose Bolton was off in the south somewhere, reaving as he pleased. The Karstarks still bore a bitter wound from the death of Lord Rickard's sons. Despair threatened to gnaw at him. He was scarcely 19, burdened with a war that had no end in sight. Winter was coming, and with it 1,000 challenges. But each night he continued the old Valyrian incantations. Each morning, that small coil of magic within him grew a fraction stronger. He needed a sign, something that would prove all of this risk had not been in vain. That sign came unexpectedly in the courtyard one afternoon. Word arrived of a large party making for Winterfell from the east. Expecting it might be friend or foe, Robb donned his armor, gathered a handful of guards, and prepared to meet this party at the gates. When they arrived, they were ragged, exhausted, many bearing the heraldry of lesser houses sworn to the Tullus. At their head rode a young knight wearing a battered breastplate. As he drew his horse to a stop, he half fell out of the saddle, knees hitting the dirt in front of the king in the north. He spoke of fleeing the Riverlands under the relentless assault of Gregor Clegane's raiders and the might of the Lannister forces. Riverrun, he said, might soon be under siege if it wasn't already. The travelers had come to plead for Robb's help or to seek refuge. Their desperation was palpable, and in that moment, something inside Robb flared. He felt his blood run hot with anger and pity. Could Tywin truly wage war so relentlessly that families were forced to flee across half the continent? A wave of determination seized him. Enough of these half-measures, enough of letting the Lannisters chip away at his allies. When the next war council was called, he addressed his bannermen in the Great Hall. The scars of battle showed in every face, But they listened intently as he declared, "We cannot cede the Riverlands to the Lannisters. That land belongs to my mother's family, to my grandfather, Hoster Tully. If we forsake them, we betray our own cause." Some argued that they could not stretch their forces so thin, but Robb overrode them. "The Moat Caelan garrison will hold. We must lead a relief force to break any siege on Riverrun and punish the Lannisters before they march on our home. Show them the North remembers." They wavered, but in the end, they agreed Robb's authority was not so easily questioned, and the men needed a bold stroke. He made the decision that he would lead this host personally. Grey Wind seemed restless, as if he too felt the call of battle. Before they set out, Robb took his mother aside. She pleaded with him to consider staying behind, letting someone else command. "You are their king. If you ride into danger—" Robb shook his head. "I cannot command my men to risk their lives while I sit in safety. That is not what father would have done. And the Riverlands are family. I must go." Caitlin pressed her lips together, tears in her eyes, but she did not try to argue further. She knew him too well. He embraced her tightly and promised he would return. That night, before dawn, Robb went once more in. To the crypt, lit the candle on the makeshift altar. He recalled the last lines of the parchment describing a war spell, used by Valyrian generals, meant to bind a warrior's vigor to elemental fury. He did not know if it would work or if it might cost him his life, but they were desperate times. He laid down a small iron dagger upon the altar, recited the words carefully. He drew a line of blood again across his palm, letting the droplets fall over the dagger. Then, placing his hand over it, he chanted until his head spun. In the final lines of the incantation, he called upon the memory of the direwolves, of the old kings of winter, and upon the dying echoes of Valyria's forging fires. He asked them to grant him strength, cunning, and a portion of their ancient might to shield his people from tyranny. The dagger felt hot beneath his palm, and he thought he saw ghostly shapes swirl around it. The crypt air shimmered, then stilled. Once again, the result was intangible, fleeting, but something thrummed in his blood, a sense that he had anchored a portion of that magic to his cause. He left the crypt with bandaged hand and a heart pounding with anticipation. The next day, the host departed. Thousands of Northmen rode or marched alongside him, their banners snapping in the wind. The direwolf of Stark, the sunburst of Karstark, the tall pine of the Tall Hearts, the Serwyn axe. At the head, Robb rode with Grey Wind trotting by his side, the massive direwolf's ears alert. The men cheered him. They believed in him, though they had tasted defeat as often as victory. They marched with the grit of men who fought for home and hearth, though the path ahead was fraught with peril. For weeks they pressed south, cutting through the harsh terrain as swiftly as they could manage, forging across rivers swollen by autumn rains. Robb consulted with his captains each night, planning how they might outmaneuver Tywin or at least break his lines. But with each day of marching, he felt the presence of that magic swirl more insistently inside him. It was as though the chanting and the incantations had awakened a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. At times, it nearly overwhelmed him. One night, as the army made camp by a broad stream, he sought privacy in the gloom of the nearby forest to collect himself. Grey Wind followed, silent as a shadow. Robb breathed in the crisp air, trying to steady the tremors running through his limbs. The warspell was swirling, demanding release or guidance. He sank to a knee, resting one hand on the cold ground. He recited a short phrase from memory, searching for calm. Suddenly, the wind around him picked up, rustling branches, rattling leaves. In the pale moonlight, he saw the silhouettes of trees bending, as if bowing to him. He closed his eyes, heart hammering, fearing he was losing control. Then, with immense focus, he willed the wind to stop. Slowly, the gale subsided, returning to stillness. A trickle of sweat ran down his temple. He felt faint. When he stood again, Grey Wind pressed against his side, offering comfort. Robb wondered if this was the power the Valyrians once wielded in earnest, command over forces so vast that only the mightiest individuals could hope to contain them. and even then it had destroyed them. He swallowed his fear. This power was his now, and he must master it or it would master him. When they reached the outskirts of the Riverlands, the devastation waged by the Lannister armies was painfully evident. Scorched farmland, blackened rubble that had once been houses, hungry peasants fleeing in rags. Robb's anger grew, fueling his determination. Scouts reported that Tywin's main force was arrayed between them and Riverrun, intending to break any attempt at relief. So the Northmen set themselves in battle formation. On the eve of conflict, the tension in camp was thick as stew. Fires dotted the wide plain where they had halted, and the men shared grim, determined glances. The Great John approached Robb, clapping an enormous hand on his shoulder. "We've followed you this far, boy," he said, his booming voice subdued. "Win or lose, we'll show the Lannisters we're not beaten dogs." "I intend to make them regret coming here," Robb replied. The Great John grinned, showing too many teeth, and moved off to rouse more men with boisterous encouragement. Near Robb's tent, Catelyn waited. She had not stayed at Winterfell after all, traveling part of the way with them to ensure her father's safety if possible. Now she found Robb standing alone, adjusting the straps of his armor in a mechanical way. "Have I told you how proud I am of you?" she asked quietly. He paused, looking at her with sorrow-laced eyes. "You have. Thank you. You look so much like him," she said, voice trembling. "I wish he were here to see the man you've become." Robb felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was dabbling in old Valyrian sorcery, that it churned inside him and frightened him, that it might give him the edge to save the family. But what words could he find? Instead, he stepped forward, embraced her tightly. "I'll bring you to Riverrun, Mother. Then we'll make them answer for what they've done." He did not wait for her reply. He could not. Dawn was only hours away, and in the first light, they would meet the Lannisters on the field. He needed to steel his heart. War was a cruel friend, and in its shadow, any sign of weakness could be fatal. At dawn, horns sounded across the plain. Robb assembled his troops in a wide crescent formation, using the lay of the land, rolling hills that would allow archers some vantage and cavalry some cover. The Lannisters were arrayed to the south, their red and gold banners flickering in the early sunlight. Robb could see glints of armor stretching in a long line, perhaps 15,000 men or more, if the scouts were correct. He had fewer, but these were Northmen, hardy and loyal. He took his position at the center, Grey Wind at his side, flanked by bannermen bristling with spears. Tywin himself was visible amid the mass of Lannister knights, a figure in ornate armor shaped like a lion's head upon his pauldron. The man had a fearsome reputation, cunning and ruthless. Robb knew the Lannister cavalry would try to break his lines with a charge. He intended to lure them in, then envelop them. A risky tactic, but it had worked before. Only this time he had a secret advantage. If needed, he would call upon the intangible force stirring inside his veins. Trumpets and drums sounded. The Lannister line advanced, foot soldiers and pikemen moving behind knights. Robb's archers loosed the first volley, darkening the sky with arrows. Shields clanged, men shouted, and war cries rang. The thunder of hooves signaled the Lannister cavalry's charge, aimed directly at the Stark center. Robb spurred his mount forward. "Hold!" he roared at his men. They formed a tight shield wall, bracing. The cavalry surged in a blur of steel and horses. Impact. The front lines shuddered, men and beasts crashing into each other in a tangle of screams. Swords clashed, spears snapped, blood spattered in arcs. Robb swung his sword, rallying those around him to stand firm, to push back. Grey Wind lunged at a Lannister knight's horse, bringing it down. Another wave of cavalry hammered into the line. For a moment, it seemed they would be overwhelmed by the sheer power of the charge. Then, from the flanks, the Great John and his men crashed into the Lannister cavalry's exposed sides. The cry went up across the battlefield. The center held. Robb slashed at the mounted knights, taking advantage of the confusion. His sword found an enemy's breastplate and bit deep. Hot blood slicked his gauntlet. He roared, lost in the moment of deadly chaos, urging his men onward. Smoke drifted across the plain as catapults hurled burning pitch. The stench of scorching grass rose. The ring of steel on steel resounded, an almost deafening cacophony. Tywin's infantry pressed forward. Now, a second wave advanced across the battlefield, hoping to break the Stark flank. Robb saw the line bending under the pressure. This was the critical point. If the flank collapsed, they'd be enveloped. Adrenaline surging, he spurred his horse toward the threatened flank, gray wind loping alongside. His voice thundered above the din, rallying men to form ranks. They obeyed, but they were outnumbered. Slowly, the Lannister soldiers were pushing them back, step by step, driving them toward the muddy banks of a stream. Robb's heart hammered. He could not let them break the line. Every breath rattled his lungs as he parried sword thrusts and barked orders. The press of bodies was suffocating. Horses screamed. Men died. The air stank of blood and sweat. Desperation rose in him, along with something else. That coiling power he had courted for weeks. He felt it stir, drawn by the chaos, the spilling of blood, the dire need. Instinctively, he began chanting, low and urgent, half under his breath, words of old Valyrian. He did not know precisely what he was calling upon, only that it answered. The swirling magic ignited within him like living flame. A wind began to gust across the battlefield, swirling dust and smoke. Northmen and Lannisters alike squinted against it. Gray wind snarled, hackles bristling. Robb kept chanting, his voice rising, the sword in his hand seeming to glow. Or was that just the reflection of the sun? He felt every hair on his body stand upright. A jolt shot down his spine. He thrust out his free hand, and a sudden gust of wind howled forward, slamming into the advancing Lannister line. Men stumbled, losing balance. Some were thrown to the ground as if struck by invisible fists. Horses reared, screaming. The Northmen gasped, seeing the impossibility of it. But they were quick to seize the advantage, driving forward with renewed ferocity. Across the ranks, disbelieving eyes turned to Robb. Even among his own men, some looked terrified, others exultant. Robb could scarcely think. He pressed the advantage, summoning the raw energy he felt coursing in his veins. He swung his sword again, and with a roar, the Northmen followed him. The Lannister flank wavered. A fierce volley of arrows from the Stark archers rained down, and in the confusion, the Lannister line buckled. The North roared in triumph, driving them back across the field. To the south, Tywin attempted to rally his center, but the Greyjohn's men redoubled their assault, cutting deep into the Lannister ranks. With the flanks threatened, the Lannisters began to retreat. Tywin, seeing the battle turning, ordered a withdrawal to more defensible ground. Horns sounded the retreat. The battered remnants of his army pulled back, leaving the field and countless dead or dying men in Stark hands. Robb slumped in his saddle, breathless, sweat-streaked, stunned by what he had done. That single gust of wind had proven decisive, tipping the scale. For a moment, the battlefield was alive only with the cries of the wounded and the triumphant shouts of the victors. A lump rose in Robb's throat. Had he truly harnessed the elements? He gazed at his sword hand, trembling from exertion. Gray wind pressed against his leg, whining softly. The Northmen erupted in cheers around their young king. They had won. The day was theirs. Many cried out, "The king in the north!" Some called it a miracle, and rumors spread quickly. Did you see the wind strike them, as if a giant had pushed the Lannisters back? Robb said nothing of spells or incantations. He simply dismounted to help the injured, to see to his men. But the knowledge burned within him like a brand. This was the reason for Valyrian magic, to defend or destroy with fearsome might. He had chosen to defend, for now that gave him solace. The Northmen pressed on after their victory, driving the Lannisters back in small skirmishes until they reached Riverrun, liberating the castle from the threat of siege. The Tully forces and the small folk of the Riverlands hailed Robb as a savior. His mother's face shone with relief as they entered the gates. Riverrun's red and blue banners snapped in the autumn breeze, and songs were sung in praise of the king in the north who had turned back Tywin's might. Lord Edmure Tully, his uncle, was effusive in gratitude, though a flicker of awe and anxiety tinted his gaze when he looked at Robb. News traveled. Tales spread of Robb Stark wielding a wind that battered Tywin's men. Some stories even claimed he breathed flames or turned into a giant wolf. Gossip grew extravagant, but all agreed something extraordinary had happened on that battlefield. Tywin's formidable host had been routed by an impossibility. Riverrun's victory feast was more subdued than some might expect, given the ravages of war. Still, the men needed rest, and so there was ale and roasted game, songs of the North's valor. Robb attended, but after a time he excused himself. Feasting felt hollow with so many wounded or dead, and the memory of that day's magic weighed on him. He slipped away to a quiet corner of the castle's ramparts, gazing at the moonlit waters flowing by. Gray wind lay at his feet. In the stillness, footsteps approached. He turned to see Catelyn. She stood beside him, silent for a moment, her eyes drawn to the same moonlit river. Then she said softly, "I heard the tales. The men think the old gods themselves answered your call." Robb's heart thumped. He did not want to lie to his mother, yet how could he tell her the truth? "Strange things happen in war," he said carefully. "Perhaps the gods took pity on the North that day." She regarded him quietly. "You have changed, Robb. The boy who left Winterfell. You were always strong, but there is a hardness to you now, a determination that borders on—" She hesitated, choosing her words. "Have we not lost enough to war that we must keep a piece of ourselves safe?" He sighed, laying a hand on the cold rampart. "The pieces of me that remain, I hold for the North, for our family. I promise, Mother, I am still your son. But these times, they require all of me, whatever that might be." She pressed her lips together, then rested her hand atop his. "I pray for your safety. I pray for your soul." Those words echoed in his mind long after she left. Did his mother sense the dangerous path he was treading? Did she worry he had become something monstrous, a warlord with unnatural gifts? Robb stared at the river, imagining the currents as lines of fate. The urge to call upon his magic again hovered at the edge of his consciousness, tempting him. Word soon reached them that Tywin, though wounded by defeat, was rallying a new force. Riverrun was safe for the moment, but the war was far from over. Moreover, disturbing whispers came from the wall. The Night's Watch had lost men, that something prowled the night beyond. Some said white shadows walked, and that the dead moved. Robb recognized these rumors from old stories, but the sense of foreboding was undeniable. The same instincts that had driven him to learn old Valyrian incantations now urged him to consider threats beyond mere Lannisters. Riverrun's walls would not shield them from the true winter. He knew he must return north eventually to hold their land against all comers. But Tywin must be dealt with first. For days, Robb conferred with his captains, refining strategy, building alliances among the Riverlands lords. He noticed that the lords whispered about him in corners, caution in their eyes. Possibly they wondered if their new king was touched by sorcery. Yet none dared confront him openly. The North needed him, the Riverlands needed him, and that singular victory on the battlefield had emboldened them. He had not used magic openly in front of them again, for fear of scaring his allies. But privately, in a tower chamber he had claimed, he continued reading the ancient parchments. When he read those words, the power within him stirred like a living flame. He found references to forging a Valyrian guardian, a conceptual force that could be shaped by strong will and sacrifice. The note on the margin, beware the cost. The cost is always high. Yet if the threat beyond the wall was real, the cost might be necessary. On the night before he planned to move against Tywin in a second campaign, Robb locked himself in that tower chamber, telling the guards to allow no one to disturb him. By candlelight, he drew a runic circle on the stone floor, copying the design from the parchment's half-blurred illustrations. At each cardinal point of the circle, he placed small tokens: a scrap of direwolf fur, a sliver of black steel from a broken sword, and a fragment of weirwood bark he had taken from a fallen branch in the Winterfell godswood. Then he recited the conjuration, calling upon the old power that once lit the skies over Valyria with dragonfire. His voice trembled. The swirl of wind in the room became intense, snuffing out one candle, then another, until only a single flickering light remained. He felt a presence coil around him, ephemeral but potent. His heart pounded. When the chant reached its climax, he drew his dagger and made a shallow cut across his forearm. Blood trickled onto the floor into the runic circle. The parchment had insisted blood was the conduit. "Protect the North," he whispered, forcing each word to ring with authority. "Guard our walls, guard our people." In that moment he felt, a shape forming in the candle's meager glow. Something tall, shadowy, like a swirl of smoke that condensed into an indistinct silhouette. Pale embers flickered like eyes. Robb almost recoiled, but he steeled himself. The shape loomed over the runic circle, silent, watchful. The air crackled with tension, as though lightning might strike. It spoke, though the sound was not truly heard with his ears. He felt the words in his mind, a question. "Are you willing to pay the cost?" He swallowed, voice dry. "I am," he managed. A hush fell. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the shape dissolved into the circle, and the last candle guttered out. Darkness claimed the chamber. Robb fell to his knees, breathing hard, blood still dripping from his arm. After a few moments, he fumbled for a fresh candle and lit it from an ember. The chamber was empty. The runic circle, smeared with his blood, looked lifeless. Had he failed, or had he succeeded? He felt no immediate difference. Then came a slow, burning sensation under his skin, like a brand etched upon his soul. The Guardian was bound to him. What that truly meant he could not say, but he was certain of it. The next day they marched. Riverrun's gates opened, and the combined forces of the Tullus and the North streamed out. They meant to hunt down Tywin's new host before it could regroup. As they rode out, storm clouds gathered overhead, ominous. Some men muttered about ill omens, but Robb felt the charge in the air. He welcomed it. They traveled hard for a week, tracking the Lannister movement. Word arrived of a looming confrontation near the Red Fork, where Tywin had seized strategic ground. When they reached the Red Fork's banks, they saw Lannister banners thick upon a broad hill. Siege engines had been arrayed, and lines of pikes bristled. Tywin meant to make Robb's men pay dearly for any assault. But the Northmen were resolute, confident in their king's leadership, if not in the supernatural rumors swirling about. That evening, as the armies faced each other across a narrow valley, Robb found himself alone with Grey Wind, standing on a ridge. He watched the Lannister campfires flicker in the distance. He closed his eyes, feeling for that guardian presence. He sensed it, swirling in the void behind his eyelids. The old parchments had spoken of forging a bond to Prot. CT the land. How could he harness it? The cost was always high, the margin had said. He gritted his teeth and whispered, "Grant me the strength to save my people. That is all I ask." The wind rustled, and Grey Wind let out a low growl, as if he sensed an unseen figure. But nothing more happened that night. Morning dawned cold, with steel-gray skies. Both armies formed ranks. The Great John led a robust vanguard, while Edmure Tully and the Riverlords formed the flanks. Robb sat astride his horse at the center, the warhorn's cry echoing in his chest. The Lannisters came forward in disciplined lines. Arrows flew. Men died. The ground was soon littered with the wounded. Again, the swirl of chaos engulfed Robb, but this time he commanded it with more confidence. He spurred his horse through the lines, shouting orders, encouraging the men. The front ranks clashed in a cacophony of swords and screams. Tywin's cavalry tried a sweeping maneuver to flank the Northmen, but Edmure's forces held firm. The Greatjon's vanguard tore into the Lannister foot soldiers, axes cleaving through armor. But Tywin had more men than expected, perhaps reinforced by House Frey or other traitors. The tide began to turn. Robb saw his center threatened. The Lannisters pressed in with pikes and heavy infantry. A wave of dread coursed through him. If they broke through, the Northmen would be split and surrounded. In that moment, he closed his eyes and whispered an old Valyrian chant, calling on the Guardian, calling on the forces he had awakened. The memory of the runic circle, the blood, the swirling shape, he beckoned them. At first, he heard only the clash of arms. Then he felt a presence, ephemeral and vast, stirring like a giant awakened from slumber. The air around him chilled. A faint shimmer spread across the battlefield, unnoticed by most in the frenzy of combat. Robb saw the edges of it, like a haze, and from that haze, shapes emerged, indistinct forms of shadow and wind that coalesced into something tangible for a moment. Men who saw them reeled, dropping weapons or shouting in terror. The shapes lunged at the Lannister lines with ghostly arms. Soldiers tumbled as if struck by invisible blows. A wave of panic rippled through Tywin's ranks. Seizing the moment, Robb and Grey Wind charged into the gap, flanked by fierce Northmen. Their cry thundered across the field. The Lannister pike formation broke, men turning to flee from the specters. It was chaos. Tywin's officers tried to regroup them, but panic was spreading like wildfire. The Greyjohn's vanguard exploited every weakness, hacking through any who stood their ground. Tywin himself, raging at the spectacle, tried to rally his knights for a desperate charge at Robb, likely aiming to cut off the head of the snake. Robb saw the lion helm glint in the dull light, and for a moment their eyes met across the crush of bodies. Hatred boiled in Robb's gut. He recalled Ned Stark on the executioner's block, the cruelty inflicted by Joffrey, the duplicity that had cost him so many of his men. He thought of Sansa, held in King's Landing, threatened by the Lannisters. The memory scorched him with fury. He spurred his horse. The remaining Lannister knights surged forward, crashing into Robb's guard. Swords sang, horses screamed. Tywin, though older, was skilled in war. He cut down 2 Northmen who tried to block him, forging a path toward Robb. Grey Wind let loose a roar, launching himself at Tywin's horse. Tywin slashed at the direwolf, the steel glancing off Grey Wind's thick fur. The horse reared, kicking dangerously. Robb lunged with his sword, aimed at Tywin's side. Tywin parried. Sparks flew. They circled in the press of violence, each trying to land a killing blow. Robb felt the swirl of that guardian presence still raging on the battlefield. The shadows battered Lannister soldiers, sowing terror. With that same force, Robb pressed his assault. He feinted left, then right. Tywin was forced on the defensive, and for a heartbeat, Robb caught a glimpse of fear in the old lion's eyes. Robb roared in anger and vengeance. He swung mightily, his sword biting into Tywin's armor. There was a crunch, and Tywin grunted in pain, blood leaking beneath the golden plates. But Tywin was not finished. With a desperate blow, he bashed Robb's sword aside and thrust forward. The blade cut along Robb's shoulder. Pain lanced through him. He gasped. Grey Wind snarled, hurling himself onto Tywin's horse again. But the horse trampled in panic, nearly crushing Grey Wind. Summoning the last of his strength, Robb twisted, slamming his pommel into Tywin's helm. The older man reeled, blood running down his face. Robb seized that moment to drive his sword deep into Tywin's chest. He felt the sudden resistance of flesh and bone, then the give. Tywin's eyes went wide. Red spittle flew from his lips. A hush seemed to descend around them, even with the roar of battle continuing. Robb yanked his sword free, panting. Tywin Lannister fell from his horse, collapsing onto the churned ground, blood blooming around him like a crimson flower. Silence, then an uproar. Lannister men nearby shouted in horror, and some tried to rush to their lord. But it was too late. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, was dead. That moment shattered the morale of the Lannister forces. Word spread through the ranks that their commander had fallen. Men began to flee, ignoring the cries of their captains. The ghostly guardians hammered them again with unnatural force, and the Northmen showed no mercy. A full rout followed. By midday, the battlefield belonged entirely to the north and the Riverlands. Robb stood in the aftermath, swaying, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. Grey Wind limped by his side, also wounded. Bodies lay strewn across the field. Smoke and the stench of death hung in the air. But they had won, and with that victory, the largest threat from House Lannister was broken. No one living could recall a defeat this devastating for the Lions of the Rock. Weary beyond words, Robb sank to his knees. The guardian shapes were gone, leaving only dust in their wake. He felt a hollowness where that fierce, swirling energy had been. He had spent so much of it to conjure them, to fuel their assault. The hush in his mind was unsettling. For a moment, he wondered if that was the cost, that the magic he had painstakingly nurtured might have burned itself out. Then he felt a faint echo, like embers still glowing in the ashes. It was not gone, merely exhausted. He, too, felt a desperate urge to rest. Men gathered around him, shouting his name in triumph, though their faces were etched with shock at what they had witnessed. The Great John hoisted Robb up, roaring his praise, calling him invincible. Edmure Tully knelt, pressing a hand to Robb's good shoulder, shaking with relief. It was a scene of jubilation mixed with fear. Robb caught glimpses of men whispering. Some looked upon him with a reverence that bordered on dread. They had seen him command the wind, summon shadows, and slay Tywin Lannister in single combat. He wanted to protest that he was just a man, only flesh and blood. But the truth was that he was not merely that anymore. Old Valyrian magic had fused with his being, and on this day, it had changed the course of a war. Perhaps the course of history. Over the following weeks, news of Tywin Lannister's death swept Westeros. King's Landing erupted in chaos. The boy king, Joffrey, raged. Rumors claimed that a fraction of the Lannister army defected, unwilling to continue fighting under incompetent new leadership. The small folk whispered tales of King Robb Stark, the wolf sorcerer, who had harnessed the ghosts of old Valyria. His name became legend overnight. At Riverrun, Robb was forced to confront the magnitude of his new reputation. Lords came to pay homage or to probe the truth of these stories. Frey envoys came skittering, eager to mend the rift. Some wrote to him as though he were more than mortal. It made him profoundly uncomfortable. The men around him treated him with a mixture of awe and fear. The Great John toasted him as the Sorcerer King at banquets, half in jest, half in earnest. But the cost soon became apparent. He began experiencing sharp pains in his chest, especially at night, as if his heart were being squeezed. Nightmares plagued him, visions of dragons in flight and swirling black smoke devouring cities. The power demanded something of him more than just spilled blood. He also realized the tension among his allies was growing. Some revered him, yes, but others whispered that sorcery was a path to ruin. The faith of the Seven might condemn him if the rumors spread too far. Could they brand him an abomination, as they had done with certain Targaryens? Despite these concerns, the North's position was now stronger than ever. The army of the North had proven itself formidable, and with Tywin dead, the West was in disarray. Riverrun remained secure, and the Outriders brought word that Jaime Lannister was apparently pinned down elsewhere. Joffrey's hold on the throne was tenuous. All of that was good news, but the crowning threat still loomed in the far north. Reports from the Wall continued to arrive, each more dire than the last. Some new terror was stirring. In the quiet of a moonlit night, Robb walked alone along Riverrun's walls, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Grey Wind padded beside him, the direwolf's limp more pronounced. It pained Robb to see his companion hurt, but Grey Wind was hardy, and the wound was healing. Robb gazed at the stars. Winter was nearly here. The air held a chill that sank into the bones, though it was not quite the deep freeze that would come. How could he abandon the Riverlands now that his mother's homeland needed rebuilding? Yet how could he ignore the North, which might face a worse threat than Lannisters or Ironborn? He thought of Jon somewhere at the Wall. He thought of Bran and Rickon in Winterfell or on the move. Sansa, still hostage in King's Landing. so many scattered threads of House Stark. But if he had truly been entrusted with this power, he suspected it was for a bigger purpose than simply toppling Lannisters. He decided then and there, the war in the south would not consume him any longer. He would push forward, secure the north as best he could, and confront the threat from beyond the wall. The Southerners could keep their Game of Thrones. If he had to, he would fight the living and the dead to preserve the north. House Stark had stood for thousands of years. He would not let it fall to nightmarish wights or an ancient evil if he could prevent it, no matter the cost. The following morning, he called a council with his principal lords. Edmure Tully attended, as did the Great John and other key figures. When they were gathered in Riverrun's great hall, he laid out his plan. "We have accomplished what we came to do. Tywin is dead, the Lannisters are in disarray, and the Riverlands are no longer under immediate threat. I will leave a garrison to support Riverrun's defense. Then I will lead the bulk of my forces back north." A ripple of surprise swept the gathering. Some argued that this was the opportune time to march on King's Landing, to overthrow Joffrey and seat Robb on the Iron Throne. But Robb shook his head. "I did not wage this war for a chair of swords. I fought to protect the North and to avenge wrongs done to my family. The realm is weakened. Winter is coming, and a much darker threat is stirring beyond the wall. My duty is to my own people first." He explained in careful words that the White Walkers or others might be more than mere legends. Some lords looked skeptical, but Edmure, gazing at Robb's stern expression, nodded gravely. The Great John, who had seen enough wonders to believe almost anything now, voiced his support. "If the young wolf says the dead walk, then we best be home behind our walls," he rumbled. And so the decision was made. Those who wished to remain in the Riverlands to continue the fight against the Lannisters could do so. Many of the Riverlords chose to remain under Edmure's command, content to defend their homes now that the might of the West was broken. But the Northmen, those who had followed Robb from the start, would soon pack up and head home. They did not cheer, for home was a distant dream, ravaged by war, but they were determined. Before leaving, Robb spoke with his mother. She was torn, wanting to remain near her ailing father in Riverrun, but also wanting to stay at her son's side. "Mother," he said gently, "I cannot ask you to come north if your place is here. You've yearned for your father and your homeland." Tears rimmed her eyes. "I've yearned for all my children to be safe. Bran and Rickon are in Winterfell if the gods are good. Sansa is in King's Landing. Arya, who knows? And you march into danger." He closed his arms around her in a firm embrace. "I must. This is the duty laid upon me. I will write to you and hopefully we'll have good tidings to share. One day we will all be together again." She held him a long moment, then let him go, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Go. May the old gods and the new watch over you. You who have become so much more than you were, for good or ill." He left her standing by the gate, the Tully banners behind her, tears reflecting in her eyes. A hollow ache burned in his chest as he rode out with the army following in a long column. The wind whipped at his cloak, the Wolf King of the North returning to his seat of power. Days turned into weeks as they traveled. The journey north was long, but their spirits were bolstered by the sense of heading home. Along the way, they encountered pockets of northern smallfolk who had fled winter or the war. When they recognized the king in the north, they wept with joy or bowed in awe. Some commented on the rumors of Robb's magic. He said little, offering only words of comfort. The magic lay quiet within him, resting, though it would stir on occasion when he felt threatened. He was more careful now. The taste of power was addictive, but he could not lose himself in it. As they neared Moat Cailin, they saw the old fortress rising from the bog. The battered towers stood like silent watchers. The small garrison there welcomed them, reporting that the Freys had largely withdrawn. The neck was theirs again. When Robb stood upon the mossy walls of Moat Cailin, gazing northward, he took in a deep breath of marshy air. He was on the threshold of his homeland, and it felt as though the land itself recognized him. Days later, they reached Winterfell. The banners of House Stark were raised again over the ancient walls. For some, it was their first time seeing the fortress in months or years. Many sank to their knees in relief or wept openly at returning home. But Winterfell bore scars. Smoke-blackened timbers marked areas that had been partially burned by the Ironborn when they had seized the castle months prior. Reconstruction had begun, but the once proud seat of the Starks still looked wounded. Bran and Rickon were not there. Rumors suggested they had been taken to safety. Robb prayed they were alive. Even so, the Northmen set to work with renewed vigor, determined to restore Winterfell. Robb walked its courtyards with gray wind, listening to the hammering of nails, the scraping of stone, the urgent calls of laborers. He remembered his boyhood, racing through the halls, shooting arrows with Jon and Theon. The memory was bittersweet. Theon's betrayal had cut deep. The question of the boy's fate lingered. But that was a concern for another day. Each evening, Robb made time to visit the Godswood. The weirwood tree stood, ancient and silent, its face carved with solemn eyes. There, Robb would kneel, reciting not only the prayers of the old gods, but also the old Valyrian incantations he now carried in his mind. The power stirred each time, but it felt calmer here, as though the roots of the old magic were intertwined with the old gods. Perhaps they were. He could not say for certain. Over the next weeks, as the first snows of winter began to fall, a steady stream of reports arrived from the wall. The Night's Watch was in dire straits. Creatures of ice and death had been sighted. Ravens carried frantic pleas for aid. Even with Tywin Lannister gone, the realm seemed ill-prepared for such a threat. Robb realized that if the legends were true, if the White Walkers were on the move, then the war for the North was only just beginning. In council with his bannermen, he spoke plainly. "We must prepare our defenses, stockpile food, and send men to reinforce the wall. The legends say these others bring eternal winter. We cannot let them march upon our homes unopposed. We must stand with the Night's Watch." Some balked, saying their numbers were too depleted after so much war. Others insisted it was not their duty to guard the wall. That was the Night's Watch's responsibility. But Robb, with that quiet authority now laced in every word, silenced them. "The North's strength has always rested in our unity. If the wall falls, we all die. Winterfell has the resources to help, and help we shall. Those who object are free to leave my halls, but they shall not find refuge here should the dead come knocking." No one left. Instead, they eyed him with that same mingling of respect and fear. The great Jon, first among them, pledged his men for the defense. Others followed. They recognized that their king in the north spoke with the weight of more than mortal might. Thus began a massive effort to bolster the wall. Ravens flew with dispatches to the scattered lords, urging them to send supplies and volunteers. Blacksmiths in Winterfell forged new weapons day and night. Scouts ventured into the deep wilderness to gather intelligence on the approach of winter and any sign of the others. Meanwhile, Robb pressed further into the arcane knowledge gleaned from the Valyrian parchments, searching for a means to counter an enemy that was rumored to be unkillable by normal steel. He discovered references to dragonglass, or obsidian, rumored to be anathema to the others. The watchers on the wall confirmed it. So men were sent to the known deposits of dragonglass in the mountains or near old volcanic sites. Every piece that could be found was gathered. Robb oversaw the forging of special arrowheads, spear points, and small daggers out of obsidian, all to be transported to the wall. As the snows deepened, caravans bearing supplies and these new weapons trudged northward, some led by loyal bannermen, some by sworn brothers of the Watch who had come south to coordinate. All the while, the power inside Robb simmered. At times, he worried that he might lose his grip on his humanity. The temptations of old Valyrian magic whispered in dreams. Why not conjure fire, conjure storms, become unstoppable? But always, he recalled the horrifying visions of Valyria's doom. The cost was too great. He would not let the North share that fate. If he used this gift, it would only be in defense, to shield his people from a nightmare older than memory. Still, the day came when he realized he could no longer simply send others to the wall. He must go himself. If the others were indeed massing, a king must stand at the front lines. He called for volunteers, and many Northmen stepped forward, fierce and proud, though they knew the dangers. The great John, of course, was the first to roar his willingness. Lord Manderley of White Harbor sent men. House Karstark, still licking old wounds, offered a contingent. Bit by bit, a respectable force was assembled. In the hush of a snow-laden morning, Robb left Winterfell once again, this time heading north with an army in tow. The cold was bitter, gnawing at flesh, and the wind howled day and night, but the men marched on, faces set, their breath pluming like smoke in the icy air. Robb felt the land around him differently now, as if the old magic in his veins attuned him to every shift of the wind, every crackle of frost underfoot. Gray wind padded beside him, coat almost blending with the drifts. At last, the wall rose before them, a colossal rampart of ice, majestic and foreboding. Robb's heart clenched at the sight. However formidable the Lannisters had been, they were but mortal foes. Beyond that shimmering wall of ice lay something else entirely, something that threatened all living men. Jon Snow was there to greet him, the half-brother, though truly cousin, that he had not seen in so long. Jon wore the black of the Night's Watch. Though the wind whipped at his dark hair, he stood straight, head high. At the sight of Robb, a flicker of astonished relief crossed his features. They clasped forearms in the swirling snow, 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. The memory of childhood, the bond they shared through Ned Stark. Jon's gaze was intense. "The Watch is grateful for your help," he said. "But I must warn you, we face an enemy like none we've ever known. Scouts say the dead walk, and the White Walkers lead them, cloaked in ice and hatred." Robb nodded, scanning the wall's massive expanse. "Then we'll meet them head-on. The North stands with the Watch." He did not speak of the power within him, but he suspected Jon guessed something was different. In the weeks that followed, the top of the wall became a hive of activity. Men patrolled ceaselessly, eyes scanning the bleak tundra for any sign of the enemy. The caravans had arrived with obsidian weapons, which were distributed among the rangers. Word spread that the king in the north himself had come to stand vigil. Morale climbed, though tension simmered. When the White Walkers finally appeared, it was a night as black as a crow's wing, with no moon. A shout went up from the eastern watchtower. Horn blasts echoed in the freezing air, 1 blast for rangers returning, 2 blasts for wildlings, 3 for the others. The men paled at that thrice-sounded horn. Fear spread like a disease, but Robb, summoned from his quarters, rushed to the top of the wall, cloak snapping in the icy wind. Jon Snow joined him. There, on the other side, they saw movement across the moonlit plain. The rotting shapes of dead men marched, eyes pale blue, led by tall figures that shimmered with cold light. A hush fell, a hush of pure dread. Then the watchmen loaded bows with obsidian-tipped arrows. Others readied spears. The Northmen drew swords, breath misting the air. Robb gazed upon the nightmare they had only read about, and a tremor went through him. But he braced himself, focusing on the power that lurked in his blood. If there was ever a time to call on it, it was now. The White Walkers advanced slowly, almost leisurely, as if mocking the living. One raised a pale sword, and with an eerie shriek, the Whites lunged forward. The men on the wall let loose a volley of black arrows. Many found their mark, and the Whites crumpled. A few White Walkers were struck by obsidian, shattering them in bursts of ice. Yet the horde kept coming, unstoppable. Pressed against the gates, clawing, moaning, piling up. The men hastened to pour flaming oil, but the swirling storm winds below made it difficult. Some Whites even climbed upon each other's bodies, seeking to scale the sheer ice. Robb could feel the dread creeping into every heart. He could taste it, thick and acrid. They needed more than conventional defenses to hold back this tide. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and began chanting softly in Old Valyrian, the words trembling in the bitter wind. He summoned the memory of the Guardians, the shadows he had once called forth. He summoned the fury that had broken Tywin's lines, the wind that had howled on the battlefield. But this time he asked not for personal vengeance, but for the protection of all that lived. The world seemed to hold its breath. A low rumble resonated in the ice underfoot. The watchman glanced around in alarm. Robb continued chanting, louder now, his voice rising in the howling gale. The sky crackled with a sudden burst of light. The watchers on the ramparts cried out. A swirl of spectral shapes descended from the darkness overhead, congealing into a shifting barrier of ghostly forms that hovered beyond the wall, swirling among the whites. The white walkers screeched, brandishing their frozen blades. The air cracked with unnatural cold. The shapes responded to Robb's call. They swept through the whites, scattering them like leaves, knocking them from the wall's surface. Some of the dead were flung back, as if hammered by invisible fists. Then, with an ear-splitting shriek, one of the white walkers raised its sword and brought it crashing down upon the spectral barrier. A flash of blue-white light exploded. Robb staggered, feeling the shock in his bones. The link between him and the swirling guardians wavered. He gritted his teeth, chanting again, summoning every ounce of will to hold them fast. Jon stood beside him, face pale, but resolute. With swift efficiency, Jon raised a dragonglass-tipped spear, took careful aim from the top of the wall, and hurled it at the White Walker below. The weapon streaked through the air, piercing the creature's chest. With a crystalline shatter, it dissolved into icy shards. A sudden hush fell. The other White Walkers regarded the watchers above with cold malice. Then they retreated, slipping away into the darkness, leaving the battered whites behind to be picked off by burning arrows and the swirling guardian's fury. Only when the last of the dead had fallen still did Robb lower his voice, letting the incantation subside. The spectral shapes faded, returning to wherever they dwelled. The men on the wall erupted in cheers and terrified sobs. They had faced the others and lived. But Robb felt no triumph. He felt only the cold certainty that this was merely a skirmish, a test of strength. The real war had not yet begun. And so he stood there, the king in the north, wind whipping through his auburn hair, shoulders burning with the effort of channeling magic. Jon Snow clapped a hand on his shoulder, eyes shining with a mixture of relief and awe. The night was bitter, the future uncertain, but the two of them, brothers in all but name, stood united upon the wall. Robb felt the power inside him, an unsettling companion. In that moment, he understood the precarious balance of what it meant to wield such forces. He had to stand between the living and the dead, between an ancient doom and the realm he would defend. The cost would be great, but his mind flew back to Ned Stark's words from a distant childhood memory. When you sit the seat of power, you must weigh all the costs, for you bear responsibility for all the lives beneath you. He would bear that responsibility. He would stand with the Night's Watch, forging alliances among the free folk if he had to, brandishing old Valyrian spells if that was what it took. The North would not fall. Winter was here, but the kings of winter had endured for millennia, and the magic of Valyria, though foreign, now intertwined with the blood of House Stark. Thus would the story continue, with the king in the north forging a new chapter in the history of Westeros. The realm might tremble at the rumors of a sorcerer king, but in the heart of that peril lay salvation. For Robb Stark had taken up an impossible mantle, bridging the ancient powers of ice and fire to ward off an even older enemy. And if House Stark stood for anything, it was the steadfast promise that winter would come, yet life would go on, guarded by those who refused to yield, no matter the darkness ahead. Snow drifted across the top of the wall, whipped into icy spirals by the wind that howled day and night, a ceaseless reminder of the far north's fury. Robb Stark stood upon the ramparts, the world spread out below him in a sea of pale moonlit whiteness. The noise of gathered men, Night's Watch brothers and Northmen alike, echoed at his back. In front of him, darkness reigned, cut only by the flicker of torches along the wall walk. His breath escaped in frosty plumes, and though he was clad in heavy furs and boiled leather, the cold sank through every layer. He stared toward the unmapped distance beyond the wall, where shadows moved in the hush of the polar night. Something stirred out there, in the trackless wilderness, an enemy that had once been myth. Now it pressed closer, real and terrible, led by White Walkers who commanded the ranks of the dead. The knowledge weighed on him like an anvil. He could almost feel the faint pulse of old Valyrian magic inside his blood, that persistent, coiling heat in his core. Not so long ago, he had been merely Robb Stark, eldest son of Ned Stark, now king in the north. He still wore that crown in everything but physical form. Yet he carried another mantle too, that of a sorcerer who had dared to awaken old powers. The cost of this path had been steep. Late at night, in the hush of his dreams, he sometimes felt the raw hunger of the magic tugging at him, remembering the taste of blood and war. He worried that one day it might demand more than he could bear to give. Still, he had to press on. The threat beyond the wall did not respect armies or crowns or steel. It would require every weapon at their disposal to meet it, and so he embraced the gift as best he could, trusting in the honor his father had instilled in him not to let it corrupt him. The men on the wall had stood watch for thousands of years, sworn to defend the realms of men. They wore black, called themselves Crows and Black Brothers, and had taken an oath to remain here until death. Many had believed that oath anachronistic in recent centuries. They saw only wildlings, frost, and endless vigil. But the old stories had come to life again, dragging nightmares into the present day. White Walkers had tested the defenses once already, and Robb had joined the Night's Watch in repelling them. Obsidian spear points and a sudden swirl of unnatural shapes, spectral guardians invoked through old Valyrian incantations, had carried the day. But that had been a mere glimpse of the true war to come. At his side, Jon Snow stood silently, scanning the tundra with a grin set to his jaw. Jon, now a sworn brother of the Watch, seemed older than his years, having witnessed horrors in his ranging beyond the wall and the confrontation days ago. The half-brothers had not seen each other since the early days of the war in the south, and they had never imagined reuniting under such dire circumstances. Yet here they were, united in purpose, men with Stark blood in their veins, facing down an enemy that threatened not just the north but the entire realm. The wind whipped Jon's dark hair around his face, and his eyes gleamed with the reflection of torchlight. His hand rested on the hilt of the sword at his hip. "It's too quiet," Jon murmured, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "I can feel them out there, watching." Robb cast his gaze into the night. On the far horizon, clouds blocked most of the starlight. "They'll come again," he answered, voice subdued. "This time with greater numbers. They know we're ready, but they won't let that stop them." Jon nodded, lowering his voice. "We've sent messages to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, but we can't be certain they'll hold if the others strike there instead. We're stretched thin, and winter's nowhere near its peak." Robb exhaled, trying to ignore the gnawing dread that had become his constant companion. "We do what we can. Reinforcements are on the way from Winterfell, Castle Serwyn, Deepwood Motte. The Grachan's men are here in strength too. It'll have to be enough." He felt Grey Wind's fur brush against his leg. The great direwolf seemed uneasy at these heights, but refused to leave his master's side. Grey Wind had already faced an onslaught of whites and had the scars to prove it. Now he huffed softly, as though sensing something that remained just beyond human perception. They turned from the edge of the wall and walked back toward the stair that descended into Castle Black's courtyard. Guard fires burned in braziers. Men hunched over them for warmth, battered black cloaks pulled tight. Robb moved carefully on the ice-crusted walkway, mindful of the lethal fall just beyond the low wall. He could sense the eyes of watchmen flicking toward him when they thought he wasn't looking. Whispers had spread about the Wolf King or the Sorcerer King, rumors of conjured storms and living shadows. Many respected him for it or were grateful for his help. Others seemed afraid, as if unsure whether such powers were a blessing or a curse. In the courtyard, the day's fresh snowfall had been partially cleared, revealing frozen dirt. Dozens of men bustled around, blacksmiths shaping obsidian arrowheads, stewards hauling crates of preserved food, or rangers returning from quick forays north of the wall, breathless with new scraps of intelligence. Samwell Tarly, a friend of John's, scurried past with a heavy stack of books about the long night and the properties of dragonglass. He offered Robb a wide-eyed nod before continuing. Robb felt a flicker of warmth. It was good to see the Night's Watch taking the threat seriously. Once, people had laughed off the stories of the others. No longer. They passed by a group of Northmen sitting by the fire. The great John, Lord Umber, was the loudest among them, regaling a cluster of crows with the tale of how he had seen Robb call a wind to sweep Tywin Lannister's knights from the field. The men laughed in rough awe, eager for any reason to lift their spirits. Robb averted his eyes, uncomfortable with being made a legend in front of these hardened warriors. His mind flicked back to that battlefield in the Riverlands. He remembered the terror, the blood, and the excruciating cost that came with wielding such magic. Nothing about it had felt triumphant then. It was simply war, pressed to extremes. John led him to a small chamber behind the common hall, where a makeshift war council had been set up. The place was cramped, the walls lined with shelves stuffed with ledgers and old scrolls. A cracked table in the middle served as their map of the far north. Stannis Baratheon's banners once hung here, so the rumors said, but that was another story. Stannis had come and gone in this timeline, or perhaps never come at all, overshadowed by the swirl of wars in the south. Regardless, the Night's Watch now pinned their own maps and messages to the walls, detailing Rangers' routes, possible wildling sightings, and the projected movements of the White Walkers. Bowen Marsh, the first steward, was there, discussing supply counts with Lord Commander Jeor Mormont's former steward, a middle-aged man with weary eyes. Maester Aemon had passed on months before, the old man's health finally giving out in the harsh winter. Dolorous Ed stood by the door, sullenly clinging to his spear and making sarcastic remarks about how the undead seemed intent on devouring them all. As Robb entered, a hush fell. The men turned to regard their king in the north, their postures tense with the mixture of respect and anxiety that followed him everywhere now. Robb and John moved toward the table. A large, rough-hewn map of the lands beyond the wall lay unrolled across it, weighted down with rocks. Scrawlings in charcoal and chalk indicated suspected White Walker sightings, white attacks, and the sometimes dwindling lines of the Night's Watch outposts. Robb laid a hand upon the table. "Report," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Any sign of large gatherings of the enemy?" Bowen Marsh shook his head. "Not large gatherings, my lord, but the Rangers speak of small raiding parties testing us. Some whites have been found stumbling around the forest, always to the north, near Craster's Keep or beyond. They don't stay long once discovered." A man in a patched cloak nodded. "Saw a group of maybe 20 dead men, trailing a White Walker near an icy ridge. Didn't engage. We only had 4 in our party. Thought it best to return and warn the watch." Robb folded his arms. "Small hunts. They're learning, probing. When they come in force, we must be ready. How are the dragonglass supplies?" John answered before Bowen Marsh could speak. "We've forged or shaped a good stock of arrowheads, spear points, and knives. It won't last forever if we face an endless horde, but every brother of the watch now carries an obsidian dagger at minimum. I've distributed more among your Northmen as well." Robb gave him a short nod. It was better than nothing. He placed a finger on a spot far north on the map, labeled vaguely as the lands of the Fist of the First Men. John had once told him a tale of that place, where the watch had been ambushed, losing many to the whites. "What about the free folk?" Robb asked. "We've heard rumors of Mance Rayder uniting them, but that was moons ago. Are they still trying to come south?" At that, John's brow creased. "Some of the free folk did move south under Mance's banner, but everything's in chaos now. The White Walkers ravaged them as well. My guess is that if Mance still lives, he's leading a desperate, scattered host, and he may attempt to pass the wall rather than fight us. We might have a chance to negotiate." Bowen Marsh grunted with distaste. "Negotiate? With wildlings? They raid our lands, murder our small folk. They are men," Robb cut in, voice firm. "They bleed, they fear the others as we do. If we can forge an alliance, or even allow them refuge, that's more living souls to stand against the dead. We can't afford old grudges now." Bowen Marsh pressed his lips together, dissatisfaction evident, but he did not argue further. The Watch, for all its tradition, had begun to face a new reality: unity or extinction. Jon turned to Robb. If Mance is out there, we need to find him before the others do. He could bring thousands more to our side fighters, even if they're not well armed. I can arrange a small ranging if you allow it. Robb considered the proposal. Venturing far beyond the wall was fraught with peril, but the possibility of swaying Mance Rayder was too significant to ignore. He nodded slowly. Choose men you trust, men with experience in the wild. If you can bring back Mance alive and willing to speak, we'll see if he can be reasoned with. Offer him what we can: passage south and farmland if he'll fight with us. The Winterfell libraries are open to no one's demands, but we can promise him safety for his people. We all share the same enemy now. Jon allowed himself a faint smile of relief. Thank you. I'll leave in 2 days. That should give us time to prepare. Robb's gaze swept around the cramped chamber, taking in the men's worn faces. Until then, keep the patrols on high alert. The next attack could be tomorrow, next week, or a month from now. The others are patient hunters. They discussed further details: supply lines from Winterfell, distribution of warm clothing, watch rotations. The meeting disbanded after a tense half-hour, leaving Robb drained. He realized again how relentless this war would be. A pitched battle against Lannisters, even when outnumbered, felt more straightforward than this creeping terror of ice and death. At least men bled and died in a comprehensible way. The others defied that logic. They turned your own fallen friends into weapons against you, and even the ground froze beneath their footsteps. Exiting the chamber, Robb made his way to the common hall, which bustled with men hunched over crude tables eaten. Bowls of thin stew. Overhead, banners hung in tatters, and the place smelled of sweat, wet fur, and boiled onions. He slipped past them and ascended another narrow stairwell to a small, private room that had been given to him and his closest retainers. The corridors of Castle Black were bleak, the stone floors half-frozen and the walls dank with centuries of damp. Still, it was better than sleeping beneath the open sky. He found the Great Jon pacing inside, large arms folded over his chest. Another Northman, Galbart Glover, sat on a stool by the meager fireplace. They turned when Robb entered, bowing their heads in respect. Despite his youth, none questioned his authority after the victories he had led them to, and the unearthly power he carried. The Great Jon's booming voice filled the small space. "Your Grace," he greeted, "was about to come find you. Thought you might have turned into a block of ice up there on the wall." Robb gave a thin smile, removing his thick cloak and shaking off clumps of snow. "I'm fine, but we're all in danger if we don't keep alert." Galbart Glover's face was drawn, hollowed by winter's hardships. "Any news from the south, my lord? Or from Winterfell?" "I expect ravens soon," Robb replied, seating himself on a battered bench. "We left some of our best men repairing the castle. The steward wrote that they found old caches of grain in the crypts, enough to bolster us for a while. If we can't hold this wall, though, it won't matter how well Winterfell stands." The Great Jon nodded grimly, then let out a ragged chuckle. "If you told me a year ago that I'd be up here on top of the world, waiting to fight a bunch of ice demons, I'd have called you mad. But here we are." "A year ago," Robb said quietly, "I was still a boy playing at war. Maybe we all were." He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble that had grown. The shadows under his eyes told of too many restless nights. Though physically he was in his prime, he felt older than 19. "Now we fight not just for the North but for all the realm, whether the South acknowledges it or not." "Bah!" the Great Jon rumbled. "We don't need their thanks. They'll kneel to you soon enough or they'll be sorry. We'll handle these others first, then teach the Southern lords some manners." Robb shook his head. "I don't want to conquer the South. I just want to keep the North safe, and if the entire continent needs saving to accomplish that, so be it. One war at a time." Galbart Glover met his eyes. "You think we'll see them again soon?" Robb knew he meant the White Walkers, not just the Whites. He shivered involuntarily. The memory of that haunting confrontation remained sharp in his mind. The glow of their icy eyes, the sound of swords made from living ice. "Yes," he said, "they won't give us too long to prepare. They don't fear the cold or the night. Each moment we have is a gift." He sat back, inhaling the faint warmth from the fireplace, and tried to gather his thoughts. The old Valyrian magic thrummed in his blood, yet it seemed more dormant in these last days. Perhaps because he was so close to the wall, an old structure laced with spells of its own, built by Bran the Builder, so the legends claimed. Robb sensed some subtle interplay of powers at work. More than once, he had dreamed of a massive swirling vortex in the sky over the wall, as though the presence of so many old enchantments drew energy from the air. He could not claim to understand it fully, but he felt it. When the great Jon and Glover excused themselves to see to their men, Robb sat in silence, letting the minutes stretch. Grey Wind, who had followed him inside, lay near the hearth, muzzle on his paws, eyes half-lidded. The direwolf's flank rose and fell in a calm rhythm, a comfort to Robb's battered spirit. If not for Grey Wind, he might have crumpled under the weight of this war. In many ways, they were one soul in two bodies, a bond that had begun the day the direwolves were found in the snows of the Wolfswood. His solitude did not last long. A soft knock at the door announced another visitor. Robb straightened and bid them enter. To his surprise, it was his mother, Lady Catelyn Stark. She stepped into the room, snow dusting her hair and cloak, her face pale from the cold. She had arrived at Castle Black only a few days past, having decided that her place was by her son in this darkest of hours, after she entrusted her father's care at Riverrun to her brother Edmure. Her expression was etched with worry, and the lines of exhaustion around her eyes reminded Robb of the heartbreak she had endured. "Mother," he said, rising to greet her, "you should be resting." She shook her head, forcing a small smile. "I rest too much, perhaps. I wanted to check on you. It's past supper time, and I'm told you missed your meal. Again." Robb realized he hadn't eaten since midday. "I had bread earlier and some hot wine." "Bread and hot wine are not enough to keep you strong," she chided, setting a small satchel on the table. Inside were dried meats, cheese, and a skin of warm broth. "Here, at least have a bit." He sighed but accepted the satchel. He took a piece of dried venison and chewed, reminding himself he needed to keep up his strength. Catelyn watched him with a mother's worry and sorrow. She looked around the cramped room, eyes lingering on the bleak walls and the single flickering torch. "I still cannot believe you're here," she said quietly. "My boy, the king in the north, commanding armies and powers I barely understand." He paused, setting aside the venison. He did not want to lie or hide, but speaking of old Valyrian sorcery with his mother felt heavy. "Mother, if you knew the darkest corners I've walked to gain this knowledge, you might wish I'd remained ignorant." She inhaled sharply, stepping closer. Her gloved hand touched his cheek. "I only wish you were safe and happy, Robb. I don't fear you or what you've learned, but I do fear what it might cost you. Magic has a way of devouring those who embrace it." He caught her hand in his, pressing it gently. "I fear that too, but the others are real, and no sword alone can drive them back. We need every edge we can muster. If it saves the North, if it saves all of us, it's worth the risk." She nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I only pray the gods watch over you, all the gods." Then she straightened her shoulders, brushing away her tears. "There is news. A raven arrived from the south. Might you read it now?" He gestured for her to continue. Catelyn reached into the satchel and retrieved a small sealed parchment. Robb broke the wax with a sense of apprehension. Southern news was rarely good. As he skimmed the words, his gaze hardened. "Joffrey still sits the Iron Throne," he muttered. "Tyrion Lannister is acting hand of the king, apparently. Word of Tywin's death has caused unrest, but the Lannisters cling to power with gold and fear. Reports say Stannis is nowhere to be found, his rebellion scattered. The Tyrells have apparently allied more solidly with Joffrey's cause." He snorted, What do they plan to do when the others march south? Catelyn's mouth set in a grim line. They don't believe it or they don't care. The capital is still filled with intrigues and rivalries, each house jockeying for advantage. They imagine the North's tales of ice demons are just that, tales. Robb ground his teeth. He had once dreamed of punishing the Lannisters for their betrayal and the death of Ned Stark. He had done that, in part. Tywin was dead, and the Lannister might was broken. But still, the wheels of power in King's Landing kept turning, blind to the threat creeping ever closer. If they remain blind, they'll die blind, he said softly, though the bitterness in his voice pained him. He did not truly wish for the realm to be consumed by the others. But how could he stop it if they refused to see? Catelyn lowered her gaze. What of Sansa? She asked quietly. Are there tidings of her well-being? Robb's chest tightened. He knew the question was coming. He returned to the letter, scanning for mention of Sansa. According to this, she's still held in the Red Keep, betrothed to Joffrey. The wedding has been delayed, they say. But no more details. Catelyn closed her eyes, anguish flickering over her features. If only we could save her. Perhaps an exchange, or... There's no time, Robb said, self-loathing surging within him. Mother, I'm sorry. I can't spare men to storm the capital, not with the others massing at our doorstep. If the Lannisters realize how thin we are, they'll move against the Riverlands again. Even if we tried, Sansa could be harmed. Catelyn nodded, though tears tracked down her cheeks. I know. It's just, she's still a child. My child. Her voice quavered. Robb stood and embraced her, letting her sob into his shoulder. He felt an echo of guilt for not rescuing his sister, but the entire realm balanced on a knife's edge. He could only pray that Sansa's gentleness might keep her safe until the White Walker threat was resolved, or until fortune changed again. They stayed like that a while, mother and son, in a Stark room at the far end of the world, with winter's cold pressing against the thin walls. Finally, Catelyn composed herself, smoothing her hair and adjusting her cloak. You should rest, she said, voice shaky but determined. The War Council can wait until morning. He nodded wearily. I will. You too. She offered a small, sad smile and left the room, footsteps echoing down the corridor. Robb collapsed onto the narrow bed, exhaustion blanketing him. Gray Wind grunted, shifting to press his warmth against Robb's legs. For a time, Robb just lay there in the gloom, letting his mind drift over the avalanche of burdens upon him. He thought of the crypts at Winterfell, where he had first whispered those old Valyrian words. He thought of the battlefield where Tywin Lannister had fallen beneath his sword. He thought of the watchers on the wall, standing lonely vigils in the freezing dark. Eventually, sleep claimed him, though it was not gentle. He dreamed of swirling snow and a great darkness creeping over the land. Shapes moved within that darkness, tall, silent figures with eyes like frozen stars. He saw a dead man's hand thrust from beneath a drift, reaching for his ankle. And overhead, he glimpsed silhouettes of dragons in flight, though whether they were friend or foe, he could not tell. The dream twisted, the images shifting to show Winterfell covered in an impenetrable layer of ice, as though entombed. Then a voice, soft as wind over tundra, asked, Are you strong enough to save them? He startled awake, heart hammering, sweat freezing on his brow. It was still dark, and Gray Wind whined softly in concern. In the gray dawn, the fortress stirred to life again. Robb ate a quick meal of porridge that stuck to his ribs and gathered with Jon and a few select men near the stables. The ranging party prepared to depart, 8 in total, each chosen for skill at arms, knowledge of the wilds, or skill in silent movement. They would attempt to find Mance Rayder and the Free Folk to open negotiations, or at least glean intelligence. The men wore heavy black cloaks over furs and carried as many obsidian weapons as they could strap on. The mood was solemn. All of them knew how perilous this mission was. The areas beyond the wall belonged to the others now, or soon would. Before they mounted, Robb pulled Jon aside. You know better than anyone what lies beyond. Be careful. We can't afford to lose you or these men. John's expression was steady, though his eyes betrayed worry. "We'll travel light. Ghost will lead us. The free folk might have watchers of their own, but I have some sense of how they move." Robb set a hand on John's shoulder. "If you find Mance, offer him terms. If you run into the others, do not engage unless forced. Survive. Return with news. That's all I ask." John dipped his head in understanding. "And you? Will you be all right here?" Robb glanced at the looming wall, flecked with new snow. "We'll hold or try to. If the others come in force, we'll need every man. But we'll hold." John gave a faint smirk. "We're the Night's Watch. Holding is what we do." Then he turned and climbed into his saddle. The ranging party rode out through the main gate, overshadowed by the colossal ice curtain. The black shape of Ghost, John's albino direwolf, slunk ahead, silent as a phantom. Robb watched them vanish into the swirling whiteness, feeling an ache of worry gnaw his insides. He busied himself through the day, organizing men to strengthen the wall's defenses. The catapults were readied, each loaded with barrels of flaming oil. Scorpions and ballistae were tested. Archers, including some loyal mountain clansmen from the north, practiced launching dragonglass arrows at distant targets. None of it felt truly enough. The foe they faced was not a normal army but a legion of the dead. Yet these preparations gave men purpose. Idle fear was the worst enemy of all. By midday, a heavy snow began to fall, obscuring the horizon in a shifting veil of white. Standing atop the wall, Robb could see only a few hundred yards out before everything vanished into a silent swirl. It was as though the world ended at that boundary. Occasionally, shadows drifted across it, raven flocks or trickster illusions in the flurries. No alarm was raised, and the hours slipped past. When evening came, a new raven arrived from Winterfell. It brought small comfort. The repairs were underway, the fortress was slowly returning to habitability, and the small folk from the outlying areas had been called within its walls for safety. The steward who had written the letter insisted that the Northmen left behind were prepared for any Ironborn raids or southern mischief, but that morale was fragile. Rumors of a monstrous foe beyond the wall traveled as swiftly as the wind, and many people whispered that the end of days was upon them. Robb frowned at the parchment, wishing he could stride into the great hall at Winterfell and reassure them all that House Stark would stand firm. Instead, he was pinned here at the edge of the world, with the weight of humanity's survival pressing on his shoulders. If the others broke through, Winterfell would be the next line of defense, but it would eventually fall unless the unstoppable advance of ice and death was turned back here. Night fell with unsettling abruptness. The snow abated, leaving a half-moon shining down, pale and cold. The temperature plummeted. Men huddled closer to the fires, silent. The wind moaned like a living creature. Robb found himself wandering the passages of Castle Black, restless, that sense of tension in his gut refusing to let him sleep. At length, he ended up at the main gate, peering outward into the gloom. A handful of black brothers stood watch, cloaks pulled tight, pikes held in gloved hands. He could see faint stars overhead, pinned above the whirling expanse of night. He closed his eyes, inhaling the frozen air. His breath rasped in his chest, and the old Valyrian magic within him responded faintly, like an ember stirring in ashes. He let out a slow breath, allowing that power to drift through him without summoning it, simply sensing its presence. It was strange to find comfort in something that had once terrified him, yet here it was. The magic seemed to hum in response to the primal hush of the far north. For a moment, Robb almost felt connected to something vaster than himself, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Then the feeling passed, replaced by the ache of the cold. When dawn arrived, pale and thin, it brought a swirl of new rumors. A wildling captive, taken in the woods north of the Shadow Tower, claimed that entire villages of free folk had been slaughtered by the others, or turned into whites. Another outrider insisted that there was a massing of undead near the lakes far to the west. The watchers on the wall could confirm none of it, but each story painted a dire picture. Tension rose, and men cast wary glances at the horizon. The next days blurred together in a routine of patrols, archery drills, and anxious waiting. Occasionally, survivors from beyond the wall arrived in small clusters, wildlings who risked the deadly cold and the threat of the watch just for a chance at safety. Some pleaded at the gates, half-starved, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. After brief skirmishes, the watch would disarm them and bring them inside, though resentment simmered among the older crows who disliked giving refuge to thieves and raiders. Robb, however, insisted. The realm needed every living soul that could stand against the others. The free folk who came in were often wounded and frostbitten. Speaking of horrors, some spoke of villages where whites walked in endless columns, guided by white walkers astride dead horses. Others described half-seen shapes of monstrous ice spiders in the high passes, though no one was certain if that was real or just old wives' tales. Robb, hearing these accounts, resolved to double the watchers on the wall, though he knew it might barely help if the entire undead host descended upon them. Sometime near the end of that week, the Great John approached Robb in the courtyard. Flakes of snow drifted around them, and the large man's beard was rimed with ice. "We can't keep the men cooped up like this forever, Your Grace," he said in his booming voice. "They're restless. Not enough fighting, too much waiting. Some are muttering that we'd be better off going back to Winterfell. The others might not come for months or years." Robb studied him. "You think we should abandon the watch?" The Great John shook his head. "No, but men talk, you understand. They get tired of the cold, of sleeping in these damned bunks, of risking their lives for crows. They want to know what we're doing. Morale needs boosting or we'll have desertions." Robb understood the problem all too well. It was one thing for lords to vow to fight the ancient enemy in the abstract, but day-to-day life on the wall wore men down, especially with winter deepening. "I'll speak to them," Robb promised. "Have them gather in the yard this evening." That night, beneath torchlight and drifting snow, a few hundred Northmen assembled in the courtyard. The watchers on the walls overhead looked down curiously, while Night's Watch brothers kept a cautious distance. Robb stood atop a crate, gray wind at his side, and scanned the men's faces. Some had fought at his side in the Riverlands. Others were new recruits from the mountain clans or from around White Harbor. All had that same wariness in their eyes. "My friends," Robb began, raising his voice so it carried, "I know you're tired. The days are cold, the nights colder, and we're far from home. You wonder if the others will ever come, or if we wait here for nothing. Believe me, I share your frustrations. But let us remember why we came. To protect the North, to protect all the lands we love, from a threat older than any feud or war of men." He paused, seeing them shift uneasily. "We have glimpsed that threat already, those whites that tried to scale the wall, the white walkers we drove off under the moonlight. They are real. They will come again in numbers we cannot fathom. If we falter, if we abandon the Night's Watch, who will stand when the dead march south? The Southern Lords? They do not believe. Or if they do, they cower in their halls and hope the storm passes them by. It won't. We know it won't." Some of the men nodded, remembering the skirmishes. Others stood grim-faced, uncertain but listening. Robb let out a slow breath. "Stay strong a while longer. We are gathering resources, forging allia. Ences, ensuring that when the others come, we will not break. You have my word as your king. I will not leave you here to freeze and starve without hope. When we fight as one. When we die defending those we love. If that's not enough to stir your courage, think of Winterfell. Think of your homes, your families, all that you hold dear. If we fail here, all of it will be lost. There is no second line." A hush followed, broken only by the soft hiss of snow. Then the Great John pounded a gauntlet fist on his breastplate, shouting, "The king in the north!" Others took up the cry, and soon the courtyard echoed with it. The men's voices were rough, desperate, but the spark of conviction was kindled anew. Robb felt a surge of emotion. He lifted his sword, letting them roar themselves hoarse. That might buy them a few more weeks of steadfast service. He prayed it would be enough. Later, as the crowd dispersed and men returned to their meager tasks, Robb retreated again to the top of the wall, craving the solitude of the frozen ramparts. Looking out across the moonlit wastes, he found comfort in the quiet. The wind stung his cheeks, and he leaned on the ice parapet. The realm seemed so vast, so empty. It was strange to think that an army of dead things could be hidden out there in the darkness, biding their time. His senses prickled. The old Valyrian magic stirred. He didn't speak the words aloud, didn't conjure illusions or wind, but he let that power rise gently within him. Carefully, he extended his awareness outward, as if seeking any sign of the others. He felt the faint hum of something in the distance, like a beacon of chill dread. It lingered far, far away, barely within the edge of his perception. He imagined it as a blot on the tapestry of the world, where no warmth could survive. Gooseflesh crawled along his arms. The White Walkers were out there, indeed. He withdrew from that ephemeral connection, feeling a new sense of unease. Each time he reached toward that magic, it felt a fraction easier. He feared a day would come when he might sink into it and not return. Yet if that was the cost, then so be it. He would do what had to be done. Days passed in much the same routine. The nights lengthened. The wind grew sharper. Food began to run low, forcing the men to ration more strictly. Spirits dipped, but they held on. Then, one morning, as Robb patrolled the ramparts, a watcher cried out, "Riders!" A handful of dark shapes emerged from the swirling snow, approaching at a canter. The gates groaned open, admitting them. Robb hurried down to the courtyard, hope and dread warring in his heart. Jon's ranging party? They were a battered group of riders, their cloaks in tatters, their horses stumbling with exhaustion. Jon Snow was at their head, his face gaunt, eyes shadowed. 2 of the 8 were missing. Another was slumped in the saddle, injured. Ghost padded behind them, limping slightly. As soon as they passed within the walls, the men dismounted, breath steaming. A cluster of watch brothers moved to tend the wounded. Robb stepped forward. "Jon," he said, voice tight. "What happened?" Jon's lips were cracked, his teeth chattering. "We found Mance," he said. "He's leading the remains of the free folk. Thousands of them, starving, freezing. They're only a few days' march away. They beg passage, Robb. They can't survive another month out there. But we were ambushed by whites. We lost Garth and Tregan. Almost lost Loren to a walker's blade." He gestured to the wounded man, who bore a bandaged arm, the wrappings stained with blackening flesh. "He's touched by the walker's frost. Maester, someone, must tend him now." Robb beckoned furiously for the healers. "See to him," he commanded. Then he turned back to Jon. "Thousands of wildlings. Are they armed?" Jon let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Some have crude weapons, but mostly they have children, the elderly, families. Mance said if the wall doesn't open for them, they're all dead. They'll freeze, or the others will finish them." He fixed Robb with a hard stare. "He's coming this way. Some might try to climb the wall if we don't grant passage." A murmur spread among the onlookers. This was no small matter. Letting an entire host of wildlings through the wall went against centuries of tradition. But the alternative was to watch them all perish, or worse, become whites that swelled the others' ranks. Robb felt the weight of the decision. Bowen Marsh and a handful of Old Watch officers would object violently. But how could they refuse? He set a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Rest. Get warm. We'll discuss this at once." Within the hour, a council was convened in the largest hall. Jeor Mormont was gone, lost beyond the wall, so the leadership of the Watch fell to a makeshift group of senior officers. Bowen Marsh was among them, as was Dolorous Ed, plus a few black brothers with varied opinions. On Robb's side stood the Great Jon, Galbart Glover, and Lady Caitlin. Jon sat near the hearth, still thawing, while another brother dabbed ointment on the frostbite forming on his left ear. "So," Bowen Marsh began, voice trembling with anger, "you want to open the gates to Mance Raider and thousands of wildlings? This is the same Mance who's raided the north for years, who once threatened to breach the wall by force. The Watch exists to defend the realm from them." Jon, weary as he was, spoke up. "We defend the realm from the real threat. The others. The wildlings aren't coming to raid now. They're fleeing. If we don't let them through, they'll die and rise again as whites. Would you rather fight thousands of dead free folk, or have them on our side?" Bowen Marsh's face reddened. "We can't just believe Raiders' claims. For all we know, he could plan to attack us once he's inside." Robb interjected quietly. "They won't attack. They have children with them, families. They want refuge." His eyes flicked around the assembly. "Our enemy is the one lurking in the darkness, the one who does not bleed. The free folk do bleed. That makes them men, like us, with the same fears." The Great Jon crossed his arms. "Let them come, I say. We've faced their raids before. If any try something foolish, we'll crush them easily. And if they help us fight the others, all the better." Lady Catelyn added in a measured tone, "My lords, the cost of compassion is less than the cost of raising more foes from the dead. In times like these, we must unite. We've already settled this matter in principle when we decided to accept small numbers of wildling refugees. The question is only scale." Scowls and uncertain mutters rippled across the room. Bowen Marsh pressed on. "We don't have enough food for our own. Letting in thousands more will strain us to the breaking point." "We'll share what we can," Robb said. "The free folk will have to learn to ration as harshly as we do. They can also help gather more supplies, hunt in the giftlands south of the wall. If we turn them away, the others gain thousands of new whites. That's not just a matter of principle, it's strategic sense." Angry debates flared, but after an hour of wrangling, a majority agreed that it was better to let Mance's people come through than to face them as an undead army later. Bowen Marsh, seeing he was outnumbered, finally relented with ill grace. "Very well," he said, "but I wash my hands of this if it goes wrong." Robb stood, the old boards of the hall creaking under his boots. "Then we prepare to receive Mance Raider. We'll set terms for his people. We'll disarm them, settle them in the unoccupied lands near the wall, or send some south to the smaller fortresses if needed. No matter our differences, we must stand together against the White Walkers." He paused, letting that sink in. "And if Mance tries to break faith, we'll do what we must." The meeting broke up in uneasy tension, but it was done. The decision was made. Over the next 3 days, scouts rode forth to find Mance's column. Jon provided directions to the likely routes. Meanwhile, the Black brothers cleared out old storage barns and battered housing along the wall. Some of the Northmen braced themselves for conflict, while others constructed makeshift living spaces. The weather grew harsher still, wind shrieking under leaden skies. Snow fell in relentless waves, sometimes burying entire tents overnight. Then at last, one cold morning, the watchers on the wall spied movement to the north. An endless line of figures trudged through snowdrifts, ragged columns weaving across the blank expanse. At their head, riders on scrawny horses flew ragged scraps of cloth that might have been banners once. The watchers who had expected to see fearsome barbarians bristling with weapons were instead greeted by the sight of families, children and elders stumbling, their faces gaunt with hunger, their limbs trembling from frostbite. Some were carried on makeshift litters. Dozens collapsed along the way, never to rise. It was a scene of grim desperation. Robb stood near the main gate with a sizable force of armed men behind him, both Black brothers and Northmen. They watched in silence as the wildlings approached. At the front, a man in fur-trimmed leathers halted, dismounted, and came forward. He was lean, with a hard glint in his eyes and a wariness in his stance, but he carried no weapon. Behind him, a giant figure loomed. An actual giant, woolly and massive, brandishing a crude club. Whispers of alarm spread among the watchers, but the giant made no move to attack. Robb stepped out to meet the man. The Great Jon flanked him on the right, Jon Snow on the left, along with Ghost. The wildling leader regarded them with guarded respect, nodding once to Jon. "Jon Snow," he said, voice rough with cold. Then his gaze shifted to Robb. "You must be the Wolf King, or Sorcerer King, some say." Robb inclined his head, ignoring the weight of that name. And you must be Mance Raider, the king beyond the wall. A wry smirk touched Mance's cracked lips. I was once. Now I'm the king of nothing but these starving souls behind me. We've come for the shelter you offered, if your word is true. Robb studied him, seeing a man with pride in his bearing, but overshadowed by exhaustion. My word is good. We'll give you shelter, what food we can spare, and you can help us defend the wall. In return, you vow no violence against our people, and you'll disarm before entering. Is that fair? Mance's gaze flicked to the ranks of Northmen, the Black Brothers in their battered cloaks, the sharpened steel and dragonglass spear points. He gave a short nod. You hold the upper hand, Wolf King. I'd be a fool not to accept. My people have had enough death. Then we have an accord, Robb said, extending his hand. After a tense moment, Mance clasped it. An uneasy hush fell, broken only by the rattle of harnesses and the faint sobs of men and women in the rear of the wildling column. History was being made, for good or ill. Under the watchful eyes of the Night's Watch, the free folk filed through the gates. Weapons were collected in barrels. Rusty axes, crude spears, chipped swords, the occasional well-crafted bow. Even so, many wildlings still carried knives hidden in boots or wrapped in fur. The watchers pretended not to notice every small blade. Disarming thousands of frightened refugees to the last dagger would have taken days, and the real threat loomed beyond them anyway. Children cried, elders coughed, and the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the stink of fear. Northmen distributed what blankets they could. Some gave out stale bread, though it was barely enough for so many. A few hot fires were lit in the courtyard, around which families huddled. Mance directed some of his people to set up tents north of Castle Black, though the ground was half frozen. The task was monumental, but at least they would not all die in the open. Jean took the lead in guiding groups to old abandoned keeps along the wall, places with partial roofs still standing. Mance himself joined Robb in a small council to finalize terms. The Great John and Lady Caitlin were present, along with Bowen Marsh, who wore a sour expression. Mance recounted the horrors his people had faced. Entire villages wiped out by the others, hundreds, maybe thousands, of corpses rising in silent armies. Some wildlings had fought, but steel shattered against the White Walkers' blades. Others tried to flee. Most vanished in the snow. As the conversation progressed, Mance's eyes flicked to Robb more than once, as though searching for the rumored powers behind those pale blue Stark eyes. Robb kept his face calm. He understood that Mance was testing him, wondering what sort of man commanded wind and shadow. In truth, Robb was not entirely certain himself, but he told Mance everything they knew of Obsidian's power and the need to unite all living men. Mance seemed to listen intently, though caution etched every line of his features. They were interrupted by frantic shouting from the courtyard. A wildling man, half frozen, screaming that something was out there in the darkness. A White Walker that had picked off stragglers at the rear. Men rushed to see, but found only empty snowscape and a few footprints that vanished into drifts. Tension spiked through the fortress. Clearly, the others were aware of the gathering. Robb's mouth went dry at the thought of a full-scale onslaught on a night like this, with so many vulnerable mouths to feed, so many families untrained in warfare. They redoubled the watch. Night fell swiftly, shrouding the world in gloom. Torches flickered on the ramparts, and restless men clutched their spears. The free folk huddled in clusters, trying to keep warm. Robb, patrolling, saw a young mother rocking an infant wrapped in fur. She stared at him with wide, fearful eyes, probably uncertain if she should trust this Wolf King. Next to her, a scrawny boy coughed, face pinched with hunger. The sight twisted Robb's heart. This was the price of survival now. Thousands of frightened refugees relying on his promise of safety. At the top of the wall, the Great John and a handful of Northmen maintained a watchful vigil. Robb joined them for a time, scanning the darkness with every sense he possessed. The cold stars overhead offered no comfort. A pale moon slid behind ragged clouds. For a moment, the hush was absolute, as though the entire night held its breath. Then Grey Wind, at Robb's side, let out a low, rumbling growl. "What is it, boy?" Robb whispered, placing a hand on the direwolf's thick ruff. Gray Wind's ears pinned back, lips curling to bare teeth. He was scenting something beyond mortal senses, something cold and unnatural. Robb held his breath, straining to listen. He heard a distant sound like ice cracking under pressure, faint but distinct. The Great John and the others gripped the wooden rail, leaning forward. The wind died. Robb felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, the old Valyrian magic stirring in his veins. Then, from somewhere in the night, came a screech, high and unnerving, echoing across the plain of snow. A second screech answered. The watchers on the wall exhaled curses. Torches fluttered as men looked at one another, fear etched on their faces. "They're here," someone whispered. Robb swallowed, feeling adrenaline surge. "Signal the fortress," he commanded. "Wake every man." A horn blast echoed, long and resonant, carrying the alarm. Below, in the courtyard, men scrambled to their posts, rummaging for weapons, half-blind in the chaos. The free folk stirred, panicked, children crying, mothers clutching them. The Black Brothers tried to maintain order, but fear spread like wildfire. Then, from the top of the wall, a lookout shouted, "Lights!" He pointed toward the dark horizon. Through the drifting snow, pale shapes glimmered, no ordinary torches. They shimmered with an otherworldly glow, a cold radiance that made the eyes water. Robb realized it was the glow of the White Walkers themselves, their bodies reflecting moonlight in ghostly hues. How many? It was hard to say. Dozens? Scores? The Watchers loaded their ballistae catapults. Archers notched obsidian-tipped arrows, waiting for the command. Robb felt the weight of the moment. This was not a small raid. It might be the beginning of the main assault. Had they come so soon, or was this still just the vanguard? The question pounded in his mind, a dull roar of dread. But he had no time for doubt. He had to lead. He grabbed a horn from the nearest watchman and blew 3 short blasts, the universal signal for the others. The sound reverberated down the wall, echoing in the darkness. The men below would know what approached. Robb turned to the Great John. "You coordinate the archers. Wait until they're within good range. We can't waste ammunition." "Aye, your grace," the Great John said, though his usual boisterous confidence was subdued. He barked orders to the archers, who lined the ramparts, fingers quivering on bowstrings. The catapult crews readied their flaming pitch. Gray Wind growled, pacing restlessly, ears flicking at every noise. Robb allowed himself a single breath to calm. Then he reached inward, feeling for that ember of old Valyrian might. He summoned it slowly, coaxing it to life, a coil of warmth battling the icy air. The words of the incantation hovered on his tongue. He had used them to break armies of men. Now he faced something else entirely, an ancient power that defied mortal lines. Could his spells hamper them as they had Tywin's knights, or the Whites in that earlier skirmish? The shimmering lights came closer, and now Robb could see the shapes beneath. Tall figures on dead horses, each crowned by eyes that burned a cold, pale blue. Around them moved shadows, ranks of wights trudging in slow formation, perhaps more disciplined now under their master's direct control. The Watchers loosed a volley. Arrows arced into the night, peppering the front ranks. Obsidian arrowheads took down some wights instantly, dropping them into lifeless husks. But there were so many. Another volley hammered in, felling more. Still they came. Then a White Walker raised its blade of ice, and a shriek cut the night. The wights broke into a run, scuttling with unnatural speed. A few began climbing the wall itself, their fingers clawing at the ice. Others crashed against the gate. Men flung flaming pitch from the catapults, setting the darkness ablaze. Wights shriveled or were smashed apart, but their numbers still advanced in a wave. Robb's heart hammered. He could see, in the distance, yet more shapes emerging from the gloom, an endless horde. Chaos descended. The men at the base of the wall fought desperately, jabbing spears through murder holes, trying to keep the whites from smashing the gates. The free folk, terrified, retreated deeper into the fortress or tried to form shaky lines with their old weapons. The Great John directed volley after volley of arrows from above. Palls of smoke rose, illuminated by the flickering flames. Shrieks of steel and unearthly wails mingled with the howling wind. Robb closed his eyes, chanting in Old Valyrian, voice shaking with urgency. He focused on conjuring that intangible force that had once manifested as spectral guardians. He had done it before. He had to do it again. The runes still lived in his mind, etched in blood and memory. The ice of the wall beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as if ancient wards struggled to either repel or harmonize with his magic. He pressed on, ignoring the chill creeping into his bones. Something answered. He felt a swirl of power gather in the air, like a storm forming overhead. The wind rose, lashing the top of the wall. Men cried out, clutching their hoods. The Great John blinked in alarm as a swirling column of wind and frost spiraled outward from Robb's extended hand, descending the colossal height of the wall. It crashed into the ranks of whites below, flinging many aside like rag dolls. Bodies scattered, bones cracking. The white walkers hissed, their glowing eyes snapping up toward Robb. The cost hit him immediately. Robb felt a stab of pain in his chest, as if a spike of ice had been driven through his heart. He gasped, nearly collapsing, but gray wind pressed against him, steadying him. The roar of the conjured gale continued, pounding the undead ranks. For a moment, hope soared. This was working. He was driving them back. Then one white walker raised its sword, pointing it toward the swirling wind. Robb felt a surge of cold that clamped onto his conjuration like a vice. The walker's power and the power of the wall itself collided with his own. The wind faltered. The swirling shapes flickered. Robb choked, blood trickling from his nose. He was fighting not just an army, but a primal cold that matched his sorcery blow for blow. He forced himself to keep chanting. The Great John yelled encouragement, but his voice sounded distant. The windstorm churned back to life for a moment, flinging more whites into the air. Another white walker joined the first, raising its blade. Robb's conjuration shuddered. In that instant, a wave of freezing energy burst from the walkers, racing up the side of the wall. Men near the battlements screamed as ice coated their armor, stiffening limbs. Frost crackled underfoot. Robb felt it seize at the edges of his conjured gale. He poured all his will into resisting, but it was like trying to dam a glacier with bare hands. Beneath him, the gate groaned under the force of the whites' battering. The watchers poured flaming oil, burning the undead by the dozens. But the dead kept coming. The entire fortress trembled with the impact. High above, archers shot until their fingers bled. The Great John himself grabbed a bow, loosing obsidian arrows in rapid succession. Below, Robb's swirling conjuration collapsed. He staggered, coughing violently, flecks of blood staining the ice. Dizziness swept over him. The white walkers turned their attention to the gate. A ghastly hush fell, broken by the howling wind and the moans of the whites. Gray wind whined, pressing close, trying to support him. He tasted copper in his mouth and realized his lips were numb. That had taken too much, and still the others advanced. Somewhere behind him, a horn blared, then another. Robb forced his gaze up. Through the swirling snow, he saw the faint glimmer of torches on the plains to the west. More men, reinforcements. The watchers on the wall craned their necks. The new arrivals looked like the free folk who had been stationed in smaller outposts. Perhaps Mance had rallied them to counterattack. Indeed, a ragged force of wildlings on horses charged the flank of the white formation, howling war cries. Though they lacked the arms to truly break the undead, they provided a sudden distraction, drawing off some of the whites from the gate. Seizing the moment, the watchers hurled more flaming pots. The gate held, for the moment. Robb blinked rapidly, trying to focus. He had to stand, had to lead. The white walkers were still out there, commanding from a short distance away, riding their dead horses. If only they could be struck down. "Your Grace!" someone shouted. Robb turned to see the Great John rushing to him. "We can't let them mass at the gate. If they break it, we're finished." Robb nodded, swallowing the iron taste in his throat. He forced himself upright. "We'll ride out," he said hoarsely. "We'll face them on the field." The Great John gaped. "Ride out? But we're on top of the wall. We can't get down in time. We'll take the switchback stairs. Gather every horse we have, including the free folks. We must strike the White Walkers. If we kill their leaders, the Whites may falter." Though the Great John looked as if Robb had gone mad, he nodded. "Aye, your grace. We'll do it." They hurried to the nearest stair. Robb's chest burned, and the world spun precariously with each step. The magic had drained him more than ever before, but he had no choice. Men scrambled to follow, archers descending to mount up. At the courtyard, Mance Rayder was already rallying wildlings who had any experience fighting on horseback. Jon Snow appeared, blood streaming from a cut on his cheek, dragging a half-frozen man to the side. At Robb's barked command, a group of crows flung the gates wide, facing out into the swirling nightmare beyond. If they left it shut, the dead would smash it soon enough. Better to sally forth in a final stand. Horses whinnied in terror at the stench of the undead. Robb forced his mount to the front, gray wind bounding beside him. He glanced at Jon, who joined him, sword in hand. They shared a wordless look. This could be the end. Then Robb raised his sword, and the makeshift cavalry surged out onto the blood-stained snow. It was chaos. The wind sliced their faces, and the moans of the Whites grew deafening. Robb's horse balked at the mass of shambling corpses, but he spurred it onward, hacking at the dead. The dragonglass-laced steel parted rotting flesh, felling the nearest Whites. Around him, men screamed, horses slipped, Whites were trampled under hooves. The White Walkers stood a few dozen yards away, observing with icy disdain. If Robb could reach them, he pressed forward, cutting a path through the undead, flanked by the Great Jon, and a knot of Northmen. A White Walker abruptly spurred its horse forward, gliding across the snow like a phantom. The sword glinted with unnatural frost. It raised the blade to strike Robb. He parried, and the clash rattled every bone in his arm. The cold radiating from that weapon was like death incarnate. But he held firm, remembering the technique from his father's lessons and from the battlefield. The walker hissed, pale eyes flaring. Robb seized the moment to thrust with a dragonglass dagger in his offhand. The walker darted back, impossibly swift, and the dagger missed by inches. Then another walker joined the fray, attacking from the side. Gray wind lunged, snapping at the creature's leg. The walker's horse reared, lashing out. Robb ducked beneath flailing hooves. Around them, the cavalry engagement degenerated into a swirling melee. The Great Jon roared, smashing Whites aside. Jon, riding near Robb, tried to spear the first walker, but the beast parried with effortless grace, nearly unhorsing him. A dreadful realization settled over Robb. These foes were not mere men. Their skill and speed were beyond human, their strength enhanced by ancient sorcery. He had to use his own power. Gritting his teeth, he began the old Valyrian chant under his breath, ignoring the agony in his chest. He called upon the swirling guardians, the war spell he had forged. Immediately, he felt the draining pull. Another spasm of pain clawed at his lungs. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, but he pushed forward, voice rising in the midst of chaos. A faint distortion shimmered in the air. Shapes flickered. The White Walkers hissed, recoiling. Robb forced the chant louder, the wind carrying each syllable. The guardians manifested, half-seen silhouettes of swirling energy that battered the walkers. One reeled, its horse stumbling. The Great Jon wasted no time. He galloped forward, brandishing a dragonglass-dipped lance, and rammed it into the walker's chest. With a sound like shattering ice, the walker crumbled, bits of frost drifting away in the wind. The second walker snarled, turning on Robb. Jon spurred forward, drawing the creature's attention, sword raised. Their blades met in a burst of sparks and frost. Jon's steel threatened to crack under the unnatural cold, but the Valyrian magic swirling around them seemed to bolster him. In that heartbeat, Robb lunged with the dagger again. This time, the tip slid between the chinks of the walker's armor. A shriek of unholy pitch tore from its throat as it burst into shards. Panting, Robb reeled in the saddle. All around, wights collapsed as the controlling presence of the two walkers vanished. Many still moved, likely driven by other walkers in the distance, but a large swath had crumpled. The men cheered hoarsely, hacking down the last stragglers. Flames flickered across the battlefield, wreathing rotting corpses in greasy smoke. His vision swimming, Robb saw at least 3 more white walkers in the distance, their pale glow receding. They retreated, it seemed, not willing to risk further direct combat. The wights left behind continued to flail or attempt to climb the wall, but they lacked coordination. The watchers up top picked them off more easily now. Gradually, the immediate threat subsided. The foe had tested their defenses, done horrific damage, and pulled back. A victory for now, but at a staggering cost. Men trudged among the broken bodies, finishing off any wights still twitching. The stench was beyond foul, a blend of decay and burnt flesh. The great John dismounted, breathing heavily, his armor dented. He let out a ragged laugh, crossing to Robb. "We showed them, eh?" But his voice betrayed the terror of facing such an inhuman foe. His eyes flicked to Robb's blood-stained lips, concern filling them. "Your Grace, are you?" Robb tried to speak, but his voice died in his throat. The edges of his vision darkened. The magic had drained him more than ever, each incantation tearing at his essence. Gray wind whined, pressing close, but Robb slumped forward in the saddle, unconscious. The last thing he heard was the great John shouting his name, the swirl of chaos, and the howling wind. Then blackness claimed him. He awoke sometime later in a dim chamber, the world muffled by pain and fatigue. A single candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on rough stone walls. Gray wind lay beside the bed, muzzle resting on Robb's leg. The dire wolf lifted his head, ears pricked in relief at seeing his master stir. Robb tried to sit up, groaning as agony lanced his chest. A figure rushed to his side. It was Caitlin, eyes red from weeping or sleeplessness. "Robb," she said softly, taking his hand. "You're awake." He blinked, voice raw. "How long was I out?" "2 days," she answered, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "We thought we might lose you. You coughed blood and fell into a fever. The maester says it was exhaustion, the cold, strain on your heart. You nearly—" "Oh, Robb," she choked, pressing a cloth to his brow. Memory flooded back. The battle, the conjuring, the white walkers shattering, then darkness. He tried to focus. "Did we hold them off? The others? We won the night," she whispered, tears trembling on her lashes. "At terrible cost. Scores of men died, but the dead retreated. Mance Raider said it was your magic that turned the tide. You and John killed 2 walkers. The rest withdrew." Robb closed his eyes, relief and despair mingling. "Casualties? High," she admitted. "At least 100 Black Brothers, another 100 Northmen. Many wounded. The Free Folk lost many too, but we still hold the wall. The dead didn't return last night. Scouts say they're camped farther north, massing." He swallowed, heart heavy. So many dead, yet they had no choice. A faint sense of gratitude flared that they had survived at all. "John?" he asked. "The great John. Both well, though battered. They helped carry you from the field. They've been coordinating repairs and patrols." She hesitated, gripping his hand. "Robb, the maester says you must rest. Your body can't withstand that kind of strain again and again. The magic, it's killing you." He looked at her, hearing the tremor in her voice. The thought was chilling. But he also recalled the unstoppable wave of wights, the White Walkers' lethal swords. "We can't fight them without it," he said softly. "Not if they come in greater numbers." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Is there no other way?" His throat felt tight. "We have to find one, or I must be ready to do it again. If it saves the realm." She bowed her head, tears slipping free. Gently, Robb touched her cheek, wiping them away. "I know," she whispered. "I just wish the gods had given another fate to my children." Robb managed a faint smile, though every breath hurt. "We're Starks, Mother. We endure." Catelyn nodded, though sorrow weighed heavily in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "we endure. And so we shall, until the dawn breaks over this long night." With that, she helped him sip some broth, and he sank back into fitful rest, mind churning with the knowledge that the next battle was only a matter of time. The others would not stop. He could not stop either. And so, between heartbreak and hope, the king in the north lay wounded in body but unbroken in spirit, clutching to the last threads of old Valyrian power and the unyielding grit of House Stark. Winter had come with the force of nightmares, but as long as he drew breath, he would fight for the living, whatever the cost.